We are recording.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Hello. I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here today. My name is McKenna Latinsky, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the International Climate Change and Maritime Heritage Interdisciplinary Perspectives Virtual Conference. To begin, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all of you who helped to make this event possible. Thank you to all of you who spread the word about this conference and disseminated the save the date flyers and registration links. A special thanks to Dr. Deb Sheffy across the world in Australia and Dr. Susan Langley here in Maryland for helping me organize this international virtual conference and aiding in making this event a success. As this is a virtual conference and is being held with participants around the world, we would like to recognize all Indigenous peoples and their continuing connections to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to all Indigenous peoples and their cultures, and to the elders, both past and present. As a student about to graduate from St. Mary's College of Maryland and pursue my PhD, I'm truly passionate about protecting our maritime and terrestrial heritage, as these resources are incredibly important to understanding history, cultures, and past life ways. Unfortunately, maritime archaeological sites around the world are threatened and impacted by climate change. Aspects of climate change, with just a few examples including sea level rise, erosion, ocean acidification, and the increased intensity and frequency of storms, are not only threatening our coastal and submerged archaeological sites, but also intangible heritage that is connected to people and changes in land use. There is insufficient understanding of how modern climate change will impact maritime and coastal archaeological sites in the future, resulting in potential loss of important cultural heritage. This conference brings together practitioners from multiple fields of study and across the globe to discuss the impacts of climate change on submerged archaeological resources through an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach. In organizing this conference and inviting the presenters that will be presenting here today, I truly believe that this conference provides the opportunity to enhance our knowledge, share new research findings, and identify present research and actions currently taking place to mitigate the negative effects of climate change on maritime cultural heritage, and to provide recommendations for future actions. During this conference session, each speaker will present for 20 minutes on a topic related to climate change and maritime heritage. 10 minutes of questions and answers will follow each presentation. Before we begin, I would like to lay out some simple ground rules. First, please keep your microphone muted to eliminate background noise. I know that you will all have some very thought-provoking questions for our wonderful presenters today. So I ask that you please add your thoughts and questions to the chat box during the question and answer session, and we will address as many of these questions as possible during the 10-minute question and answer period. I also ask that all attendees please turn off your cameras in order to save bandwidth use to ensure our presentations today run smoothly. Lastly, I ask that everyone is respectful and considerate during the question and answer period and throughout the conference. There will also be a short break sometime between 11 and 11:30, and this will give you guys a chance to stretch your legs, get a drink of water, etc. With that, I would like to begin this first conference session by welcoming our first presenter, Dr. Randy Larson. Dr. Larson is a professor of chemistry and program coordinator for the Environmental Studies Department at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Dr. Larson will be speaking on the new marine science major recently approved at St. Mary's and how this major is important in considering climate change and maritime heritage. So if Dr. Larson, you want to show your screen and then begin your presentation, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Sure, here we go. Let's see if this works. Now that I just shared my screen, I no longer have images of anyone or even my icon. So can someone write in the chat if they see the slide?
We're seeing your screen, but not your slides.
Let's try that. Stop sharing. Let's try. How about now?
We can see your slide.
All right, great. So thank you, McKenna. Thank you everyone for joining us here at St. Mary's. I find this to be remarkable. This organization, this presentation, this conference. I'm seeing we hit 50 people exactly at the moment, participants. For something to be organized by an undergraduate gives me hope that things will get better as we've all been dealing with the stress of COVID and wondering what in the world is going to happen. Seeing the youth like McKenna be able to organize such an interesting conference on this topic that's so important, I am just thrilled as the director of the Environmental Studies program here at St. Mary's. As McKenna said, my background is in marine and environmental science. I came to St. Mary's in 2002 as an assistant professor in the chemistry department, where I teach analytical methods. And it was through that experience I started working with archaeologists here at St. Mary's College to analyze artifacts. And next thing you know, a couple decades have gone by, and the college has been reinventing ourselves like many colleges around the United States. And we were looking at programs that would be in line with what our greatest strengths are. And so St. Mary's College, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, lies on a small tributary of the St. Mary's River that feeds into the Potomac River, which feeds into the Chesapeake Bay. We are probably just a half an hour boat ride from the Chesapeake Bay. The Potomac River divides Maryland and Virginia. And what's special about St. Mary's College of Maryland is you would think with the name St. Mary's College, you would think it was religiously affiliated, but it's not. St. Mary's College is a state school. It's a 4-year undergraduate program. And it is located on the site of historic St. Mary's City, which was the first established location colony in the Maryland colony. And you can see in this image right here, this is St. Mary's City, not much city about it. Over here on the right is historic St. Mary's City, and here's the college with their waterfront community. Well, given our location, we felt that it was about time for the state of Maryland to offer an undergraduate marine science program. And so we designed a program starting about 2 years ago in marine science and tapping into faculty from a variety of backgrounds. We have toxicologists, we have marine archaeologists, we have marine microbiologists, myself as a chemist, and some marine ecosystem biologists or environmental scientists. we hope to provide a stepping stone for people, for students who want to pursue marine science more broadly than just being a biologist, but to be able to explore different areas of the marine environment, including marine archaeology. And so those of you that have worked in academia know that it takes a while to roll a ball uphill, and it's been the process. We started this proposal several years ago. It went through multiple iterations at the college level to get all the faculty on board, to get the faculty senate on board, to get it approved by the faculty as a whole. Then it went to the administration, went through several layers of administration with the provost and the president. Every time the project got refined and improved, and then it went to the board of trustees who gave it the thumbs up and have agreed to provide some financial backing. And as we sit right now, the proposal is sitting with our state regulators, the Department of Education, and they'll make the final decision. We hope that it'll be in the next few weeks. And so the plan is in place to roll this out for fall of 2021. I know we have people in academia and in government research organizations. Academia, over the past several decades, has become more formalized and more organized. And we can think of our marine science program as having foundational discipline-specific experiences, outside the classroom research experiences, and then a capstone experience. And so there's a list of courses that all students have to take. These are ones you would, this list of required courses was developed based on looking at requirements for graduate programs in marine science, as well as looking at job announcements for entry-level marine scientists and their course expectations. And we also layered on top of that what we had available intrinsically already at the college. And so, besides the required courses, there are a variety of elective courses. These courses are based on ones that we already have here at the college, like our underwater archaeology course. We hope to grow this list of elective courses as more faculty come on board and become a part of this process. But you can see these elective courses cover everything from biology to archaeology to chemistry to environmental science. There's a lot of data analysis courses in here. Quantitative methods is going to be a really interesting course offered this spring using R and Python to do large data set manipulations. So students have some opportunity to customize what electives they want to choose to control and customize their own education. Besides the elective classes, St. Mary's is committed to a curriculum that's modeled off of experiential learning. And so we have an experiential learning component of this major, which requires students to either be involved in independent study, directed research, or obtaining an internship in a marine science related field. And we'll come back to this in just a minute. And then at the end of their senior year, the fourth year of school, there'll be a capstone experience. And so the capstone experience can be met through an independently developed 8-credit research experience, which here at St. Mary's, we call the St. Mary's Project, which is what this SMP stands for. Alternatively, for students who aren't interested or aren't in a position to design their own research experience, there's an alternative ability to complete more advanced traditional class like senior seminar course. And we've designed the major so that it can accommodate students who want to double major in any of the STEM fields. And so they only have to do one senior experience if they're double majored. Now, creating a major from scratch is really a chicken and the egg kind of scenario. We don't have any students majoring in marine science currently. And so, of course, there's no funding for it, which means there's no staff, there's no students. And so to break that chicken and the egg kind of scenario, this new major is going to evolve, especially in this opening stages, to spin up a brand new major, spinning up a brand new department. While we have about a half a dozen faculty on campus already, they're currently affiliated with specific departments, either biology, anthropology, environmental studies. And so as this program comes online, we are going to be hiring faculty that will be specifically in marine science and begin to migrate faculty around so that this is a standalone program. And with those new faculty will become new opportunities for new courses. Hopefully that'll build with student interest. We have expectations to acquire all the resources needed to run a marine science program in terms of facilities, research vessels, equipment, etc. But starting from scratch also means that there's no institutional connections with communities. And so this was a great opportunity, and I appreciate McKenna offering me the opportunity to talk to all of you to put out a call that this is an undergraduate only program, and our students will be looking for experiences, research experiences, experiences to learn in general. And so if you are aware of opportunities or you think you would like to work with St. Mary's College, I'd like to hear from you. You can send me an email at rklarson@smcm.edu, and we could discuss how we could work together. Specifically, we have, as I mentioned, this experiential learning opportunity. So we're looking to place students in summer research experiences. We will be doing our own, but I'm hopeful that we'll grow to the point where we have more students than we can handle. And so hopefully we'll find opportunities for them to explore other areas. This is not only for traditional research grade experiences, but also opportunities to work in marine science in general, which includes the kind of work that all of you are interested in. I know in the past we've sent students up to the Navy Archaeological and Historical Institute up in Washington, D.C. We've sent students to local museums. And so that kind of opportunity would also be very relevant. And we've actually, as part of our curriculum, been very aggressive in fundraising so that we can pay our students to volunteer at nonprofit institutions. And lastly, we're committed to giving students an international experience. And so we have an international education office here on campus. We're currently looking at the schools that we routinely send our students to. We know there are courses at University College Dublin, James Cook University that would be appropriate, but I'm sure there are plenty of great opportunities out there. And so if you're an international institute and you do accept students for study abroad opportunities, I would love to hear about what there are. And so with that, I appreciate you giving me the time to speak. about the new marine science program here at St. Mary's College. And I think I have stopped sharing my screen. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. Do you all have any questions for Dr. Larson? We have about 10 minutes.
Well, I know all of you are well past the need to go to school and get a new major. So I appreciate you taking a few moments to present our new major here at St. Mary's College. And if you know of anybody that would be interested, please give them a shout out. We hope to be advertising this more broadly as soon as we get a final approval from our state regulatory agency. So, and yeah, our marine science website is live now. So, yeah.
Well, thank you again for your presentation. It was really good.
Thank you.
Our next presenters include Dr. Tom Dawson and Dr. Joanna Hambly. Both Dr. Dawson and Dr. Joanna Hambly are research fellows in the School of History at the University of St. Andrews, all the way in Scotland. Both Dr. Dawson and Dr. Hambly helped to set up Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk program, otherwise known as SCAPE, and they will discuss SCAPE and the recording of heritage along Scotland's eroding coast today. So if you would like to share your screen, that would be very much appreciated.
Can you, hello, it's Tom here. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint.
Oh, what are you seeing there? Are you seeing the first slide?
Yes.
Great, okay. Hi, so it's me, it's Tom who's giving this talk, not Joe. And firstly, I do need to apologize because I missed the bit about the 20-minute talk and the 10-minute for questions, I'm afraid. So you're going to be subjected to 30 minutes of me speaking very rapidly. However, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll just respond to them afterwards. I'm really sorry about that. I honestly didn't know this was a 20-minute talk. Okay, so as McKenna said, we're with SCAPE, Scotland's Coastal Archaeology and the Problem of Erosion. And erosion has been a recognised problem in Scotland for many, many years. And these beautiful artefacts are from Skara Brae up in Orkney. These are Neolithic, and they were discovered during excavations which have occurred since that site was first uncovered in a storm in the 1850s. So we have a very long history of dealing with heritage at risk from natural processes. Now, to start us off, I just want to go and look at this. This is from one of our national newspapers. It's called The Guardian, and it's reporting on a book written by Caitlin de Silvey. And I do have to stress that these are the words of The Guardian who are sort of interpreting what Caitlin was saying. And it's great that The Guardian was discussing heritage at risk. But at the beginning there, you can see that Caitlin asked the question, or the Guardian was asking the question, should it be that some historic landmarks should be permitted to decay gracefully through a policy of managed continuous ruination? And I've put the bold in there because I think there's three little things involved in that question. So put that thought in your head. And now we're going to have a quick look at St. Andrews Castle. So this is where we work, St. Andrews, and it is an area, as you can see from the sign, which is prone to erosion and cliff falls. And here is an image from John Geddes' map from 1580, and that shows the castle in all of its glory. Sleazer depicted the castle in 1693, and by that time, quite a lot of it had fallen down onto the beach. And this very early image from 1868 shows the castle, and you can see there a ruin, but you can see also the strata of the rock below the castle. And that's because we're in an area of coal mining, of sedimentary rock, and this sedimentary rock is very, very prone to erosion. And also, obviously, the shipwreck there indicates that we do get quite big storms every now and then, which cause large parts of the coast to disappear. Okay, so coastal erosion is not a new thing, and there are armies of shoreline managers out there who think about this problem and come up with plans. And typically, there are three main solutions. Well, in fact, there's two main solutions, but I'm going to list the three usual ones that we'll get in the UK, one not so common as the others. So the first one is defend the line. This is building coastal defenses. This is putting something hard in the way of the sea to stop the coast edge from disappearing. And the one that isn't so common, but is used sometimes, is managed retreat. This is where previous coastal defenses are deliberately breached and land is allowed to be flooded to act as a barrier, often creating a sea marsh or a great habitat for birds, but also dissipating the power of the waves. And then the third one, and this is the most common, is something which is called no active intervention. It used to be called the do nothing approach, but do nothing was slightly negative, so it's now called no active intervention. And this is where you don't do anything, you just allow natural processes to go ahead. This is all well and good, but of course, if you have an archaeological site which is being affected by erosion, doing nothing means that it will disappear eventually. Right, let's go back to St. Andrews again. So here is another photograph, and this is even earlier, 1846, this image. And there you see the castle, and you see the strata below it. And here we have an image taken today. I hope that you saw that change, because I've just realized that this is PowerPoint, and sometimes you can't see these on Zoom. But now you're looking at an image showing the castle with a coastal defense below it. Okay, and what happened was in the 1880s, and this photograph was 1885, the forerunners of Historic Environment Scotland erected a coastal defense. They put up a hard barrier in order to protect that castle. And they did it quite stylishly. They made the coastal defense look like it was actually part of the castle. So you can see that it looks a little bit like a tower, and you can see that the stonework matches that of the castle itself. And on the right-hand side, that diagonal shaped bit of what looks like rock is in fact itself concrete as well, where they've mimicked the rock type with the coastal defense. And they've also incorporated some of the fallen stonework within the coastal defense there as well. So a very thoughtful bit of work. And going back to Skara Brae, where I started this story, here you have an aerial image of the Neolithic houses. And at the top of the image, running along there, that is the coastal defense with the beach above it. And this is Skara Brae's coastal defense, another fine looking example. Of course, the thing with coastal defenses is that it doesn't stop the areas around it from eroding. So if there's no wall, erosion will continue to happen. And in the end, your monument will end up being on a little island sticking out into the sea, as is happening here at Skara Brae. And what they have to do is they have to keep repairing and increasing the size of the coastal defense to keep up with the erosion in the surrounding area. And if you don't continue to maintain your defenses, something like this can happen. So this is at East Weems. And on this coastal defense, the flat, smooth bit of concrete at the top, that is the part that used to be above the ground, and all the rough concrete below, that used to be buried under beach sediment. But the sediment has all been washed away, and it means that the sea can now go below the concrete wall, and it has destroyed the water pipe that it was designed to protect. More importantly, from a heritage point of view, is in those rocks behind are the Weems Caves, the site we're going to be talking about in a minute, and the erosion there, the water is coming in and getting closer and closer to the historic monuments. And here are some more fallen coastal defenses, these ones again at Weems. And here we see some members of our Learning from Loss team investigating some destroyed coastal defenses at an old salt making site here in Fife, very close to St. Andrews. Okay, so building a wall can stop erosion from happening, okay? And the problem that we have with heritage is that we do need to do something. We know that our sites are vulnerable. We're just not quite sure when it is that the damage is going to occur. So here we have a map of the coast of Balasha over in the Outer Hebrides, and the area there that is circled contains a large farm mound, and at the bottom there were Bronze Age sites, buildings and structures and artifacts, and in the middle there were Iron Age structures and some burials, and at the top there were the hints of Viking remains. And we know that because in the 1980s, a team of archaeologists went in because of the fear of erosion, and they cleaned up the section, and they had a look, and they took dating evidence, and they took samples. This image, taken in 1992, so that's after the archaeologists were there, shows that in fact there had been very, very little erosion in the 46 or so years between the first and second photograph, maybe about a meter, that's all. Now a meter is quite bad, but it's not disastrous. But in 2005, this happened. And in one single night, overnight, that site was completely destroyed, within places between 30 and 50 meters of the coast being washed away. So the problem is, we know where the sites are, we just don't know when they're going to be affected. It could be tomorrow, it could be in 50 years' time. Who knows? Now, here is an image of a group up in Brora in the Highlands of Scotland, north of Inverness, and they're working on this fantastic building that they were concerned about. And we worked with the Brora group to uncover this. This is the oldest industrial building in the Highlands of Scotland. This was an industrial scale salt pan, a place for making salt. We managed to, well, Jo ran the excavations. She excavated the site. She made 3D models. She took all the samples. Everything was meticulously recorded, which is just as well, because this is what the site looks like now. Not long after the excavation finished, it was taken away in a storm. And this is a more recent example. This is a photograph of Hearst Castle down on the south coast of England. Hearst Castle looked like this until last month, well, until February, so about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. And Historic England, who are the national agency who are charged with looking after this place, they had set aside roughly about $1 million to go and make repairs to the coastal defense in this area. Unfortunately, before they could start work should be going on right now, but before they could start work, there was a storm, and this is Hearst Castle at the moment. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you these things is because there is a lot of truth in this idea of things being allowed to decay gracefully through a policy of continuous ruination, but there really has to be a choice made in there. People have to decide, this is what we want to happen to that particular site, okay? And at Hearst Castle, that was not the choice, and so at the moment, poor old Historic England are getting all sorts of flack. Now, I've already mentioned the Learning from Loss program. This brought together some of our colleagues from America. You can see Sarah Miller there sitting in the front, and Marcy Rotman, formerly with the National Park Service. They met up with Historic Environment Scotland. These are our government national agency who looks after heritage in Scotland, together with local authority archaeologists and other curators, and also members of local communities. And the core group of us, we spent 11 days going around the east coast of Scotland and up to the Orkney Islands, visiting heritage sites, and also meeting up with community groups to ask them or have discussions with them about heritage, about the loss of heritage, about coastal erosion. And we also organized meetings in village halls up and down the country where we would go through a set of formal questions to discuss the loss of heritage. And there were many, many take-homes from this, but a couple of the take-homes that we got was one, and I can't actually read this because the top of my screen is hidden, but basically, natural processes will destroy archaeological sites, and we must make sure that sites aren't lost by accident. That would not be acceptable to the public. And secondly, communities said that communities desire respect to be shown to heritage, and that there should be these conscious and informed decisions that go into a site. So you have to go and say, yes, we're going to protect this one, but it means that maybe we can't work at that particular site, but at least this decision has been made, rather than this default position of things being lost because no one has done anything and no one's thought about it. And the third one was that a lot of the group said that it was urgent that practical projects should happen at some of the sites right now before they are lost, so that we do need to be actually working with these sites as opposed to just collecting information. Okay. Now, this whole idea about collecting information, this is the key to making the decisions on which sites we work with and which sites we allow to go, okay? And in Historic Environment Scotland has been working on coastal surveys since the mid-1990s. And in 2000, we joined them and we started managing the coastal surveys. Teams of professional archaeologists go out and they look at the geology and the geomorphology of the coastline, and they look at the erosion class on the day of the actual survey. And of course, they record all the heritage sites that they see, and they put the information into these gazetteers. So we have standardized information from all the places where archaeologists have visited over the years. Scotland has a very long coastline. It's second only to Norway in Europe, so it's a big place. And at the moment, 35% of the coast has been looked at. It means that all those areas in red are still awaiting survey, and that is something that we at Scape are going to be working with partners on in the future, as soon as we can get back out again. And in the 35% of the coast that's been looked at, 12,500 sites were recorded, and this is in a corridor which is only 50 meters wide. So this 50-meter corridor, 12,500 sites. We looked at all of this data in 2010, all the collected data we had up to then, and we prioritized the sites because we thought we need to be doing more than just collecting the data. We need to be making lists of places where we can work. So I won't go into too many details, but basically we looked at the value of the site and we looked at the risk that the site was under, the threat that was posed to the site, and we combined the two and we said, okay, high value, high risk, this is a top priority. Okay. At the end of this process, we had roughly 1,000 sites which were either high or top priority. And obviously these are only spread around in the areas where the coastal zone assessment surveys have taken place. We were very aware, however, when doing this prioritization project, that things change rapidly at the coast. So we started the Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk project, or SHARP, and this was building on our previous community projects. And the idea behind SHARP was that we were going to have two elements. The first was shore update. And in the shore update, we wanted to get the public moving away from the slightly more traditional role of passive observers of archaeological work taking place. We wanted to get them actually more involved. So here we see a group walking along the beach with an eroding site in the coast edge above them. And we wanted them to get out to places, and we would give them training, and we would show them how to record sites and how to record all the information in a standardized and methodological way. The crux of our project was the sites at risk map. So we made a website and we took all of the information from the coastal zone assessment surveys on the left, and we put them onto this interactive map, which was color-coded according to priority. And as you zoom in, you got to see all of the sites, and then you could edit the records and you could update the records. And to help with that updating, we also had an app. This project started back in 2012, as you can guess from the style of my phone there. And on the app, you had access to the map, but you could also add new heritage sites. So if you found something while you're out looking for a site that you're trying to update, you could add that. You could use the app to record your location and to take some photographs and send that information in to us. And also importantly, because you don't always get a reception when you're at the coast, you could also download forms in advance. So you'd be able to download maps and download the information. This is a typical view on the app. So here you can see the site of Featherland up in Shetland, and by clicking on one of those dots, you would get the description, and at the bottom, if you click the use this form, you'd be able to go in and you could edit that description or the name. You can take a photograph. There were sort of very simple yes, no questions and some bits of information that we wanted. And then everything would be sent into us for moderation. And this was an absolutely key stage in the process. We looked at every site, we checked the information that was sent in, we looked at the photographs, and then we would update our sites at risk map. Now, just to let you know that we're now, because SHARP is finished, we're now setting up a new website, and we have a new sites at risk map, which is, we're getting ready to launch, and we will have a new app as well, which is very exciting. And this app will allow us to draw polylines and things like this. And we've made it in such a way that we're hoping that without too much bother, I mean, there's going to be some need for modification, obviously, but without too much bother, we're hoping that we'll be able to share this app with other organizations if they're interested in doing that. The second part of the SHARP project was the shore digs. And with the shore digs, we wanted to move away from people going around finding sites and recording sites, which was fantastic in the first place. So we were actually going even further beyond that and get them actually in there doing the surveys, detailed drawings, and even excavations. So members of communities up and down Scotland, working with them, training them up, in just in the same way that many people go and train up students and work with students, we were working with members of communities. And it worked absolutely fantastically. We did 14 projects and they were all community-led. And we wanted to be experimental and creative. So we didn't want to just rely on excavation. We wanted to try a whole range of different methods. But the most important thing was that these sites were ones that were nominated by the local communities. These were places that were locally valued, places that they wanted to go and save and work at. The first step was always have a meeting. We'd have a meeting with the local group and we would discuss the site that they were interested in. And we would sort of propose different options and they would come up with different options and say, well, we could do this, or you could do that, or we could do the other. And in the end, they would come up with a plan and we would work with them to try to make sure that this plan came to fruition. So we would help them, put them in touch with specialists, and we would work with them on obtaining funding if it was necessary and all the rest. And very quickly, I just want to show you 3 examples of the different types of projects. So this is one of Joe's projects up at Chanowick in Shetland, up in the very north of Scotland, some islands. Here, the local group became interested in a recently exposed, an exposure on the coast edge, which came about after a storm. All these archaeological layers were seen. And so they went up and they cleaned up the section. It also gave a chance to take scientific dates. So here you see OSL, optically stimulated luminescence samples being taken. There are also samples taken of the bone, of pottery, and radiocarbon dates and the rest of it. And the group were able to clean everything up and draw everything and interpret it. And they worked out that in fact what they were looking at was a broch. This was one of these Iron Age towers that you get in the north of Scotland. And within the broch, there was a wheelhouse. And in the center of the structure, you can just see, just in the center down here, there was a well, a broch well. Absolutely amazing. If you don't know what a broch looks like, this is the broch of Moosa, also up in Shetland, superimposed onto the excavation there. Now, you just don't find brochs normally. We kind of know where all the brochs are. So this was a remarkable discovery by the local group. And this is what the broch of Moosa would look like if it was superimposed onto the village of Chanowick. Moving south a little bit to the Orkney Islands, to the island of Sandy, the group at Muir, or the group on the island, wanted to work with some remains that were found at a place called Muir. So there was a big storm. It uncovered these stone structures. An excavation, a very rapid excavation was held, and it showed that this was actually part of a Bronze Age burnt mound. So in this little rectangular sort of bar thing, this is called the tank, that water would have been in here, which was heated up by throwing hot stones into it. Now, we don't know why this was. It might have been a sauna, it might have been for feasting, but they found one of these very unusual structures. You don't normally find them built of stone in this way. But after the excavation, the sea came back in, it covered the site up, it put debris over everything. And so the group wanted to move it. And they wanted to take the site and put it next to their heritage center in the middle of the island. So we worked with the local community and they did the excavation and they numbered up all of the stones. And while they were doing that, we were able to uncover everything. So here in the center, this is the tank. And then going off towards the grass, there was a passageway. Under the grass was the Hearth Cell. So this was a little structure where they had the big fire. And then up at the top of the picture, the horseshoe shaped thing here. This was originally thought to be a cistern, but upon excavation, we actually realized it was a Bronze Age well with several steps going down, a remarkably well-preserved, fantastic thing, which was actually full of organic material, beetles, wood, shell, and you can see lots of seeds and all the rest of it. During the dismantling of the structure, we also found another well, quite remarkably, here in the center of the picture. This turned out to be a Neolithic well, predating the burnt mound. And so we were able to take dates from everything. And you can see we have date ranges from 2400 BC going all the way up to 590 BC. So a very long-lived site. But of course, we also had to remove everything and take it away from the beach because the sea was destroying all the evidence. So with the local community, we put ropes around the stones, hoisted them up onto tractors and trailers, moved them across the island. And within a very short time, we were able to go from this to this. And we work with the community to make interpretation. So you have an interpretation board. They also have interpretation within the community center where they're talking about climate change and the risk of heritage, and also highlighting some of the other hundreds of sites that they have on Sandy, which are washing away into the sea. And to finish off at the Weems Cave. So this is actually very close to where we are here in St. Andrews. This again is an area which is prone to coastal erosion. The circular structure there is a pigeon house that was destroyed by the sea. And we also have landslips in this area. But the caves here, and there are many, many caves along that stretch of coastline, they have these remarkable Pictish carvings. We think they may date to maybe 300, 400, 500 AD. But there's also graffiti from the 19th centuries. And there's also this remarkable boat carving you can see with the oars and a guy at the back with the steering oar, which may be Pictish or Viking. There's debate over how old that is. So the local group at Weems, they wanted to make the whole site accessible to the local community, but also a much wider community and indeed the whole world. And so they wanted to put all the information they could onto an interactive website. And we worked with them to do this. We used laser scanners to do detailed laser scanning. And here is one of the caves, and you can see up at the top right there, circled, that is one of the carvings. The laser scans mean that we're able to do slices through. So at the top, we have Macduff's Castle, and down below it, we have one of the caves. So this is very good for a management point of view. We also use drones in order to record the entire landscape. And here is a model of the landscape. And we go out, in fact, I was just out there last week taking yet another set of drone photographs. And so we have sets from every year for about the last 8 years now, which are helping us to see how much erosion has been going on. The community were also very interested in reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. If you don't know what that is, I recommend you Google it because it's absolutely fantastic. It's free and it's from California. And the local group went out and they photographed every single one of the carvings. And by taking a series of photographs, they're able to make these 2.5D models, which are all up on the website. Local people also brought in photographs and we digitized all of these. And we had oral history sessions. So we were able to record people talking about their old memories of what the village used to be like and their memories of the caves and coastal erosion, because this is a very rapidly eroding bit of coastline at the moment. And members of the community were also involved in making films. And all of this information was put onto the 4D Weems Caves website. So that is a massively quick run through everything there. What I'm hopefully trying to show here is that as long as we make choices and we work at certain sites and we keep people informed, then hopefully we can keep on top of erosion. We probably can't save everything, but we can at least make a difference. If you want to learn more about the learning from loss, there was a video there and there's also other outputs on this page. But what I'm going to do is in the chat, I'll put up links to all the things that I've just spoken about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really eye-opening to see how much of Scotland's coast is being eroded. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for all the work that SCAPE is doing. We do have a question, and that is, did you find people's attitudes about climate change and sea level rise changed after having the opportunity to assist with the archaeological work? Did documenting the sites give people an increased sense of loss, or did they find it empowering?
Okay, I would say that usually most people who live by the coast are fairly aware of coastal processes and what is happening. We made another film recently over in the Western Isles where we were talking to local crofters, that's local farmers, after the big, this is the area where the big storm was, where 50 meters was lost overnight. And they had the idea after that storm, and not because of being involved in archaeological work, but because they saw the effects of the storm. They thought that this was climate change and they were going to start seeing these regular storms happening every year. And in fact, what they have noticed is at the moment, we seem to be going through a period where storminess has decreased. And this is a thing with storminess. Sometimes it's up here, you get lots of storms, and then it goes down, then it comes back up again. So I think in answer to the first part of the question, people who live by the coast are probably quite well aware of what is happening around them. But of course, being involved in the heritage projects means that we can publicize the results more widely to those people who don't necessarily live at the coast and try and get the information out a little bit further.
All right, we do have some more time for questions and answers. And our next question is, how have you found the take up of the app? Are lots of people using it still? Has COVID had an impact on people taking part?
Okay, so yes, definitely COVID has had an impact, but also we finished the Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk project a couple of years ago, and we're just about to start this new project where we're going to do these community coastal zone assessment surveys. So we're actually going to be going out with the communities, mapping the coast and looking for new sites with community members. That was meant to start in March of last year. So just as we were about to start, COVID hit, and so we haven't really done anything. And we made a very conscious decision, because we do have quite a lot of restrictions in the UK as to what people are allowed to do and how far you can walk, especially up here in Scotland. So we made a decision not to kind of encourage people necessarily to go out during COVID, but it looks like, hopefully, fingers crossed, things are getting better. So we're really looking forward to starting up this new project, hopefully within the next 2-3 months or so, and get out there. But the take up with the app was very good. But the thing with apps is you also need to couple this with training as well, and also with support and moderation and giving people feedback. Just making an app and sticking it up onto a website and having a bit of publicity on the news doesn't mean that the app will be used necessarily over the long term. You'll have a short spike and then things will die off. So what you need to do is keep in touch with the communities, keep in touch with the people sending information in, let them know that you're interested in the information, and more importantly, that it's meaningful information that you are using. But we had, well, Joe can give you the exact numbers, but I mean, I think there's well over 1,000 people using the app.
Wonderful. Our next question is, how important are the coastal zone surveys to those doing this work? How to compensate when surveys are not possible? Or what can you generally say about where CZS have and have not been done?
I don't really, I think I saw this question popping in. I think it's from Sarah, but I didn't quite understand. Can you just repeat the first part of it again? Or maybe
sure. I can actually have, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. So my question is, how important are the coastal zone surveys to those doing this work? Who do you mean by those doing this work?
I mean us. You know, like where doing that coastal survey isn't part of the research model. Does it need to be first? Or I also see it's like two-pronged. The coastal zone surveys are still being done. So I'm just curious, as a focus, or generally, like, is it impossible to do the work without the coastal zone surveys being done in advance, or has it worked out different ways, different times? So just to see the pros and cons of going after the complete coastal zone survey.
Okay, yeah. So as I said, we'd only done 35% of the coast when we decided to start taking action on some of those sites. So obviously you need to have some form of baseline, because you need to make these informed choices. So you need to have a database, and it depends on where you are as to how much data you have. But once you've got some data, then you can start making the choices. We've found that with the coastal surveys in general, it would double the number of sites that were known about. So although we've had a history in the UK of people going out and recording sites for 150 years or so, generally the number of sites have massively increased because of the coastal zone assessment surveys. And doing the surveys does mean that you can go through and you can make a list and say, right, well, within this like 10-mile stretch, you've got 5 really important sites, and then you can put those to the people. But you don't have to do the surveys. If you know where the sites are, then fine. But doing the surveys just means that you've got more information on which to base your decisions. Does that answer the question, Sarah?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was looking for my mute button. Now looking for it again. Thanks.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any questions? All right, well, I guess we can move on to our next presenters. Thank you again, Dr. Dawson, for your wonderful talk. So our next presenters are Dr. Zachary Canizzo and Miss Madeline Roth. Dr. Canizzo is with the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation, and Miss Roth is a CPC under contract to the Maritime Heritage Program, and they will both be giving their presentation in support of NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. They will be speaking on incorporating climate change into the management of NOAA's federally protected underwater and maritime heritage and cultural resources. So if Dr. Zachary Canizzo or Ms. Madeline Roth want to share your screen, you can try that, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, McKenna. All right, let's see if that works all right. You all seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Great, then I will hand it over to Maddie.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Before sort of delving into our presentation, I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank both McKenna and Susan for putting together this opportunity. We're very grateful to both be able to share this research with you, but also to learn from this collective body of researchers that have been brought together today. My name is Madeline Roth, and I'm a maritime archaeologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. I'll be co-presenting today with Zach. Turn it over to you, Zach.
Thanks, Maddie. Hi, I'm Zach Canizzo. I am the visiting climate scientist and climate coordinator at the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. So I'm in support of the NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and NOAA's Climate Program Office.
Today, our presentation is sort of a forward-thinking presentation about incorporating climate change into the management of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's, or NOAA's, federally protected underwater maritime heritage and cultural resources. Zach, if you don't mind going to the next slide. NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries currently is the steward of 14 American National Marine Sanctuaries, 2 National Marine Monuments, as well as 2 sanctuaries that are currently proposed and are sort of in their designation process. Now, these marine sanctuaries and monuments are diverse, both in their geographic locations, but also within their environments. So the habitats that these sanctuaries and marine monuments encompass vary greatly. On the East Coast, we have deep water areas such as Monitor, as well as shallow water tropical areas and Flower Garden Banks and Florida Keys and Gray's Reef. We had an expansion into the Great Lakes environments with the incorporation of Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and the 2 currently proposed National Marine Sanctuaries would further NOAA's footprint within the Midwest and the Great Lakes systems. Out on the West Coast, we have everything from kelp forests to extremely deep water areas such as Monterey Bay and Cordell Bank, as well as our Pacific Islands monuments and sanctuaries, which again vary in both their depth, the species that are there. And so as you can see, we really have this diversity in terms of habitat, salinity, species, and water temperature that both make management a challenge because we are working with so many different environmental parameters, but also create some incredible opportunities for research across the National Marine Sanctuary system. Zach, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Perfect. The first National Marine Sanctuary that was created almost 50 years ago was created to protect the remains of the Civil War Union vessel, the USS Monitor. And when it comes to thinking about maritime heritage across our marine sanctuary system, this is the quintessential site where you have an oceanic site. Has a number of processes going on. It's been identified as nationally significant and protected as such. But as we've expanded the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, the scope of the resources that we aim to study and understand has expanded with that. With the introduction of Thunder Bay and the Great Lakes, we began working with a new environment that was low saline, this fresh water, which has incredible preservation opportunities for organic remains because it's fresh, deep, and cold. And so Thunder Bay has this incredible scope of vessels that are protected within the sanctuary boundaries that offer some incredible opportunities for research. But again, the resources that we were expanding with this new sort of geographic footprint were still those very quintessential maritime heritage resources and shipwrecks, aids to navigation, wharfs, piers, docks, all sorts of marine infrastructure. Zach, if you don't mind clicking once more. And even with our newest sanctuary site, this is the Mallows Bay Potomac River National Marine Sanctuary. The heritage focus here is an incredible collection of the World War I fleet created by the United States. But while again, we were expanding into a new environment, this is a tidally influenced river just outside of Washington, DC. Again, our maritime heritage focus has been in this newest sanctuary, primarily shipwreck focused. And so a lot of our past thinking about maritime heritage and heritage preservation really was based in these sort of quintessential, tangible resources. Next slide, please. But of course, our resources are just as diverse as the sanctuaries that we manage. Everything from intangible values, traditional craft practices, place names, to our histories and heritage of science and the research that's gone on in our sanctuaries is under our umbrella of maritime heritage and maritime heritage resources. So throughout the rest of this presentation, when we're discussing heritage and heritage resources, this is the full spectrum of both tangible and intangible remains, practices, belief systems, pieces of ecological knowledge that are contained within our sanctuary system. So these are place-based pieces of heritage that we have mandates to both preserve and protect. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Maddie. And one of the things that we want to really make clear is that in recent years, the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries has really increased its prioritization of climate change and trying to get a better hold on how climate change is affecting the resources that sanctuaries protect, including our heritage resources. And one of the major steps in doing that was incorporating a climate change question into our condition reports. So these condition reports are these documents provide a summary of resources in each sanctuary, the pressures on those resources, the current conditions and trends, and the management responses to pressures that threaten the integrity of these resources. So these condition reports are critical because they inform the management of these special places that sanctuaries protect. So by incorporating a climate change specific question into these reports, it's really helped sanctuaries focus on how climate is impacting these heritage resources. Additionally, just last year, we began a partnership with NOAA's Climate Program Office, of which my position is a big part of, which is really aimed at helping sanctuaries get a better understanding of our climate information and science needs. And this is important because in order for us to address climate change and how it's affecting our heritage resources and other resources, one of the main things we need to do is identify our knowns and unknowns with respect to climate change. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are a lot of unknowns in terms of how climate change is going to affect underwater heritage resources. So another major project that we've undertaken, which I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about, are these climate change impacts profiles. And you can find them at this link here. I will put it in the chat as soon as we're done. But these profiles are really a first step in helping sanctuaries identify what these knowns and unknowns are in terms of climate change. So we've created one of these profiles for each one of the sites. I will note that the monitors profile isn't quite finished yet, should be up by the end of this month. And each one of these profiles are relatively short documents. They're about 8 pages, about 4 pages of text once you get rid of all of our fun pictures of our beautiful sites. So they're a relatively quick read. And each one of them focuses on 4 major climate drivers of concern to the sanctuary and highlights 2 case studies, one of which is a regional scale issue and one of which is focusing on all the different ways climate change impacts a focal resource at the site. So one thing I want to make sure before we dive into what some of these profiles have shown us with respect to heritage resources is to make sure that you know that these are really science driven. The first steps in creating these profiles are an extensive literature review and expert input. We want to make sure that these profiles are as up to date as possible and as reflective as possible of our understanding of how climate change is and is expected to affect these sites. So for example, right here, you can see the citations page of the Mallows Bay profile, which has 50 cited scientific resources in about 4 pages of text. So we really did try and dive into the scientific literature as much as possible to highlight how climate change is and is expected to impact these heritage resources. So I'm going to give you a few examples here so you kind of see what you will find when you dive into these profiles, but also to highlight some of the things that we've learned in terms of how climate change is expected to impact these heritage resources. So the first we're going to do is one that might be a little bit unexpected, and that's the changing ecological communities at Mallows Bay Potomac River. So hydrilla is a prevalent invasive plant in the sanctuary. And for those of you who are on the east coast of the United States, you're very familiar with hydrilla. It forms these incredibly thick mats. You can see in this picture here, they're impossible to see through. And oftentimes we think of them as a nuisance because it makes it more difficult for us to see these heritage resources that we've come to see. Now, warming is expected to actually favor hydrilla and other invasive submerged aquatic vegetation. So at first we might think that's probably not good. They're going to be favored. They're likely to be thicker. It's going to continue to obscure these resources that we want to learn from and that we want to preserve. But actually, one of the things that is important to note is that submerged aquatic vegetation, including hydrilla, can actually buffer against some of the major effects of climate change on the heritage resources in this site. The key one, of course, is ocean acidification. So ocean acidification is expected to increase the degradation of these maritime heritage resources. But by pulling carbon dioxide out of the water for photosynthesis, hydrilla can actually locally buffer against the effects of ocean acidification. There's also some suggestion that these thick beds of aquatic vegetation can help to slow water flow, which might help to counter some of the effects of things such as increased tidal period and storm surge water flow from storm surge and floods that we expect to see happen more regularly and with greater intensity as climate change progresses. So that's an example of a way that climate effect, the increasing the growth of hydrilla, may actually help to counter some of the other climate effects that we expect to see on these maritime heritage resources in our sanctuaries. An example of a more classic example is the impacts of climate change on the Joseph S. Fay in Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So the Joseph S. Fay is a partially submerged wreck. So part of the wreck is underwater, classic, which you might think of as an underwater heritage site. But a large portion of the hull is actually beached and found on the beach. Now, this portion of the hull that is on the beach is incredibly important for local communities. It's a recreation location. It's also important for helping students learn about maritime heritage. But changing lake levels could threaten the Joseph S. Fay, both the submerged portion and the unsubmerged portion. In particular, these highly variable lake levels, which are expected to become more variable as climate change progresses, could increase the wet-dry cycle, which can greatly enhance the degradation of the beached portion of the wreck. Additionally, lower lake levels could increase the exposure to sunlight of the submerged portion, again, increasing degradation. Finally, ocean acidification could damage the submerged portion of the hull, particularly the copper hull sheathing, which is a little bit more susceptible to ocean acidification than other parts of the wreck. And then a slightly more unexpected impact, unexpected resource are these native fish ponds in Hawaiian Island Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary. So this is key, understanding that even those sites within the sanctuary system that were not designated for maritime heritage often have heritage resources that are both important to the sanctuary, important to the local community, and could be impacted by climate change. So in Hawaiian Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary, we have these incredibly important fish ponds. So these are these native Hawaiian fish ponds that are very culturally important. Many of them were built over 500 years ago, and they were very important to Native Hawaiians, particularly pre-colonially. However, there's only about 50 of them remaining. But those that remain are very important to Native Hawaiians. They provide a tangible connection to the past. They are culturally important in their connection to the past, and some of them also still function. However, sea level rise threatens these fish ponds. Sea level rise could overtop walls, and it could also salinate the groundwater supply, which can prevent the formation of the brackish water conditions that these ponds depend on to work correctly. Finally, more obviously, they could be damaged by increasingly strong storms. So this is just a really good example of how even in these sites that are not designated for heritage resources, there are heritage resources that we want to protect that are important to local communities, but could be affected by climate change. So having a better understanding of how climate change is and is expected to impact these and other heritage resources within our sites is an important first step that these profiles seek to address. So I'm going to turn it back over to Maddie.
Thanks, Zach. So as part of the sort of spectrum of federal resource agencies in the United States, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries is really guided by two pieces of legislation. The first is our own internal legislation, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. And within this act, we are mandated to monitor cultural resources, the term cultural here being the language in the act, but really it's the full spectrum again of maritime heritage resources. The National Marine Sanctuaries Act is essentially preservation heavy in that these are places that have been designated as national marine sanctuaries and monuments because of the resources they encompass. We know that they are nationally significant as well as locally or regionally significant, and that in order to preserve these resources for this and future generations, we are called to monitor and understand these resources. The other piece of legislation that gives us some mandates over the heritage resources within our sanctuary and monument boundaries is the National Historic Preservation Act. And this act is much, I would say, more deliberately focused on surveying, inventorying resources, and determining their significance. There's language, of course, that people may be familiar with, the Section 106 that can that calls for federal agencies to take their actions into account, whether they are going to adversely impact resources, and then to mitigate those impacts if possible. But again, the National Historic Preservation Act as a whole calls on us as a federal agency to be conducting active survey and inventory within our sanctuary and monument sites. And so really the core concepts from these two pieces of legislation that guide our approach to cultural resource management monitoring are the creation of an inventory and database, as well as a subsequent monitoring plan. Next slide, please. Currently, within the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, we're reanalyzing these pieces of legislation and trying to redevelop a new approach for the future. The current step that we're on is developing a sanctuaries-wide inventory system for a baseline inventory of our sanctuary resources and their systematic monitoring. In the past, individual sanctuaries had their own inventory and monitoring systems. However, with thinking about my program, which is the Maritime Heritage Program's role in understanding resources across the sanctuary system, we've begun reevaluating the things that we should be inventorying. And part of this is to track climate change criteria. Some of the things that we're looking at with this new database system, which is currently in its prototype phase, include the site environment, primary resource material regarding construction, the condition and integrity of that resource, descriptions and identification of both threats and disturbances, as well as their effects on the resource and their timeframes. We're also considering past and future management actions that may have impacted the resource, as well as affiliated cultural groups and organizations. Next slide, please. In thinking about where we're headed with all of this, the step that we're currently on is implementing that database monitoring system across the sanctuary system. And that, again, is to both get a better understanding of the current baseline of our resources, as well as to start assessing potential future climate change impacts. Another step that we're currently working on is that science needs assessment that Zach briefly discussed, in thinking about, as we incorporate climate change into our management strategies, what are those unknown areas of climate change, those areas that we can't predict or that we need more information to fully understand the impacts of climate change to our maritime heritage resources. This, of course, will always be ongoing as our climate changes, but it's something that we're trying to assess now so that we can put out some of those requests for data, those requests for projects that will help us better understand climate change's impacts to our maritime heritage resources and to mitigate or to adapt to those impacts. The final stage that we're beginning to think about, but of course will never really fully be realized, is implementing realistic management strategies. Of course, a lot of the research and literature that's coming out looking at climate change impacts to maritime heritage resources talk about adaptive mitigation or adaptation to a changing climate. One of the things that we are, of course, faced with is that there are things that will always be outside our control. We're not going to be able to reverse ocean acidification or sea level rise by ourselves at NOAA. One of the things that we can do, though, is implement mooring buoys, such as this buoy at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, to reduce anthropogenic impacts from anchor damage and boat traffic over some of our maritime heritage resources. Next slide, please. Of course, another management strategy that we're trying to realistically implement is better baseline documentation with the understanding that we will never be able to preserve to the extent that we should these maritime heritage resources. And of course, the question that comes up is, what are we trying to preserve? Is it the sites themselves or is it the data they contain? I don't think this is necessarily an either or argument to be made, but one of the things that we are trying to do is to collect that information that will help us understand and better protect these sites and their historic value, their cultural value, their regional significance, their local significance, and to collect data that's meaningful, that can be shared with others, but that will also help us more fully understand and ultimately manage these resources. And so some of that data may be conducting photogrammetric assessments of some of our heritage sites to bring them to a wider audience. Next slide, please. Within my own program, the Maritime Heritage Program, which is part of the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, in short, our sort of forward approach is really driven by three current initiatives. The first is that baseline data collection and the implementation of a system-wide inventory looking at climate change impacts. The second is that we are focusing on Native, Indigenous, and tribal engagement as we move forward in the management of our marine spaces. And again, that final initiative, which Zach and I have both touched upon, is our climate change heritage science needs assessment.
And for the ONMS, the Sanctuary Office wide initiatives, one of the main initiatives that we're undertaking initially, that we're undertaking right now is the development of a climate resilience plan, which will help guide the office in its addressing climate change in the coming years. Additionally, we're going to continue partnerships with the Climate Program Office and other NOAA programs because we recognize that partnerships, particularly within NOAA and with other partners, are going to be key to our ability to assessing and addressing climate change within national marine sanctuaries and the heritage resources that they protect. So with that, I think we will happily take any questions.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful to hear that climate change is being taken into consideration in regard to NOAA's protected maritime heritage and marine sanctuaries. We do have a question. She says, thanks so much for this excellent presentation. She said, I pulled up the climate change impacts profile for the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. The report does not appear to directly reference any underwater cultural heritage there. Is there a plan to produce a separate report detailing the impacts for the extensive UCH at that site?
Yeah, I could take the beginning of that one for sure. You're right. Unfortunately, a lot of the profiles do not highlight the heritage resources at the sites. The early scoping of these profiles, we're sitting down with the sites to try and figure out what we could cover in ultimately a very limited amount of space. So unfortunately, that site does not have mention of its maritime heritage, and I apologize for that. There isn't a plan at the moment to specifically address the heritage resources at that site in a similar product, but I do think that is something that we should look for in the future, a way to take a look at the heritage resources in all of the sites and specifically take a look at how climate change is addressing them and create a public facing document similar to these profiles, but there isn't a plan at the moment that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I would say, so from the maritime heritage perspective, because we are a PAM sanctuaries program, our current focus is trying to, again, conduct that science needs assessment for climate change impacts across the board. And so while we'll certainly address the types of resources that will be found in sanctuary areas or similar environments like Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuaries, we don't have any plans currently to address individual sanctuary sites. But of course, that's one of the hopes, is that with the science needs assessment, we can then begin to develop plans or data calls or even individual profiles. And those are, of course, all different sort of avenues that we can begin to work towards in terms of trying to understand the scope of climate change to our sanctuary system.
Perfect. Our next question is, it's so good to see NOAA including cultural resources in its planning. When I worked at ONMS, we were never able to get those resources included in higher level NOAA strategic plans. Has that improved?
I'll take a stab at that. So I should note that one of the things that, since I've been working at Sanctuaries, which is just over a little over a year now, is that there's been certainly a re-emphasized focus on understanding maritime heritage across the sanctuary system, and not only climate change impacts, but really reassessing the heritage resources that we have and what our mandates are to them. And so part of the information that we just presented has really come out of this renewed need to both think about our resources, but also the best ways that we can preserve and protect them. And so I think across ONMS, we really have seen a recommitment to trying to understand and protect those resources.
Wonderful. Our next question is, are there any in situ conservation / preservation steps taken on the wrecks that get exposed by changing water levels and experience sunlight and fresh air exposure, like the Mallows Bay Sanctuary and the Joseph S. Foy wreck? Have the wrecks degraded since they were discovered?
So Joseph S. Foy is in Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And I actually say I know Stephanie Gandula is on the line with us. She's the research coordinator at Thunder Bay. So I'll give her a chance to respond to the second part of that question in a second. And the thing that I'm going to say about Mallows Bay is that as it is our most recently implemented sanctuary, the baseline data that we have at Sanctuaries, of course, doesn't fully encompass the history of that site. It's long been visited, and certainly the work done by Don Chamet has demonstrated that there has been active degradation at that site. Currently, there are no in situ conservation or preservation steps taken in regards to site stabilization, which is sort of what I'm hoping are interpreting your question as. But one of the things, of course, moving forward is that with Mallows Bay being such a recent sanctuary, recently designated sanctuary, that is, we've partnered with East Carolina University to begin collecting some of that baseline documentation and to getting a better understanding of the state of those resources. And I know that several of the folks on this call are actively involved in that work.
This is Stephanie up at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. Thanks for the opportunity to respond about the Joseph S. Fay, an outstanding shipwreck site. And like Zach and Maddie mentioned, it's a perfect classroom for not only teaching about maritime heritage, but also understanding the effects of particularly changes in lake levels. So a little bit different than sea level rise, which of course is climate change. Effect of climate change, but lake levels fluctuate. It seems almost a much more complicated a process, because it's not just rising continuously. It is, very low one year, very high one the next year. And so the Fay has definitely seen a lot of degradation, and it might be a little tough to separate what is climate change effects and what is just the nature of being a shallow site where it's very, very dynamic. So just nature of time, it definitely has seen degradation since over the years, and certainly since the sanctuary was designated. And it's also a good classroom to study the effects of climate change, I would say.
Wonderful. Our next question is, do you have methodologies established for monitoring marine sites that can be applied elsewhere?
So that's a great question. As we've been revamping our policy, this is one of our key areas is developing a monitoring plan that both meets our federal mandates and that can be widely adapted to incorporate some of these other considerations. Currently, we do have a monitoring plan that's in its draft form, which I'd be happy to share with you. And I would say the best thing you can do is email me directly. I'll put my contact information in the chat. We do have some constraints, and I'll say that our monitoring plan is actually largely adapted from the National Park Services, and that the National Park Service is the stewards of the federal archaeology program, and there are certain considerations that they put forward that we have to meet as a federal agency. So that is, I would say, sort of the structural formation of our monitoring, is that there are these certain pieces of baseline information that we are called to collect as a federal agency. But I'd be more than happy to share some of that, those considerations with you.
All right, and our last question is, are there also partnerships in place so that data from monitoring of underwater heritage sites can feed back into understanding climate change? So not just looking at the impacts of climate change on heritage, but also how the heritage can be used to inform climate change planning.
Sure, and I'm actually going to turn this over to Hans von Tilburg, who's also on this call. He's one of our maritime archaeologists with the National Office of Marine Sanctuaries. Hans, if you want to address this.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Maddie. Yeah, these are just emerging. We looked around and began to wonder if we had our own best practices, for instance, for addressing these types of impacts to heritage resources. And lo and behold, we didn't have any specific best practices. And we found that we weren't the only ones that didn't have any specific best practices directed at this. So it's something we've started down the road doing, compiling, archived reference documents. As you know, there are many that are technical and deal with impacts to specific types of resources. But as a program, we're also interested in, management practices and how we could incorporate, this information into guidance, which we do need. And so to that end, we are discussing, a broader response with the Ocean Foundation, with the Heritage at Risk and climate impacts committees of the Society for Historical Archaeology and ACUA and others to share this information, because, you know, we don't need to have a stovepipe response to something as broad and important as climate change impacts. It's best to do this, you know, in a room with others. And so we're taking that approach and drafting some best practices that would be suitable for the sanctuary system and based on the needs of all of us. And so partnerships are emerging.
Well, thank you again for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of the attendees who took the time to answer some questions. Our next presenter is Dr. David Anderson. Dr. David Anderson is a professor of anthropology at the University of Tennessee. He will be giving a presentation on addressing climate change and the loss of cultural heritage through a perspective from the southeastern United States.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to start by thanking McKenna for inviting me to this, and to all of you for listening. It's a wonderful presentation session, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Well, we're all exploring two big questions. How does climate change threaten cultural heritage? And then how do we respond? And in this paper, I'm going to look at those questions, and I'm also going to suggest what it might cost. The emphasis in this talk is on terrestrial resources. However, many of the recorded sites and structures we work with are in tidal and nearshore environments, as we've seen in the preceding talks. Now, slow onset climate and related changes linked to cultural heritage. There are a number of things that affect it: sea level rise, permafrost melting, changes in precipitation, temperature, in biota, ocean acidification, the subject of the next talk, changes in health and mortality, and then migration inland into healthier areas. Sudden changes in these variables are what are called rapid onset events and are known as extreme weather events. Now, sea level change is, of course, something that we're all interested in this session. And there are a number of different scenarios for sea level rise through the remainder of this century, with projections from under a meter to perhaps 6 meters or more. One of the things my colleagues and I have done is look at the occurrence of sites that are threatened by sea level rise. And in the southeastern United States alone, in a 9-state sample, there are literally thousands of sites that are at risk. Basically, a 1 meter rise will affect 20,000 known recorded sites, and a 5 meter rise close to 30,000 known sites. Of these, 1,300, given a 1 meter rise, are on the National Register of Historic Places as eligible properties. Now, the study that was done in the Southeast has been done in a number of parts of the world. These are World Heritage Sites in the Mediterranean Basin, looking at the effects of sea level rise on them. And there are studies from other parts of the world as well. Now, sea level rise will affect a wide range of sites. The Lighthouse Explorer gives a list of 56 threatened lighthouses that are within a few meters of moderate sea level. And I actually believe, based on work at Body Island, that there are probably many more lighthouses at risk. This gets into relocation as a form of climate mitigation. Moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is perhaps the most famous example. 4,800 tons was moved 3,000 feet inland. The Kennedy Space Center is a major historic and, of course, active site at risk. And interestingly enough, Saturn V rockets weigh about the same as the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, so we're used to moving large objects. It isn't just the large and the dramatic. The Union of Concerned Scientists did a study showing that 2.4 million residential properties and 100,000 plus commercial properties worth over $1 trillion are at risk in our country from chronic flooding due to sea level rise. The permafrost regions occupy 23 million square kilometers in the Northern Hemisphere. Those are at risk as well. The melting of the permafrost includes between 7 and 8 million square kilometers in Alaska and in northern Canada in our hemisphere alone. The nature of the preservation in these environments is remarkable. It requires substantial recovery, conservation, and curation efforts. Other affected changes include in precipitation and temperature, where dramatic changes are expected this century. And in biota, basically the projected changes in ranges are pretty dramatic from 1990 to 2100. Ocean acidification, again, which we'll be seeing as CO2 in the ocean increases, the green in the chart, pH decreases and acidification increases. This has effects on submerged cultural resources, as we've seen and will continue to see in these sessions. There'll be dramatic changes in health and mortality, particularly that will result in migration. There'll be changes in the ideal human temperature niche that are pretty dramatic, meaning that people will have to move to avoid unusually hot weather. Now, extreme weather events are also something that will be occurring increasingly, and this is the IPCC definition. It's an event that is rare at a particular place and time of year, and that basically means it's rarer than the 10th or 90th percentile of a probability distribution. So you're all familiar with this chart. Extreme weather events are increasing and will continue to do so. Perhaps the most dramatic in recent years in the United States is Hurricane Sandy as an extreme weather event. And slow onset climate change coupled with these extreme weather events will lead to millions of people having to move in the years to come. In fact, a substantial portion of the Earth's population will need to migrate inland or to cooler areas, something that is being called managed retreat. These slides, this is being recorded, and I'll be happy to email these slides to anyone as well so you can get the references and the details. Now, protection in place is not an option in most cases. That's why we call it managed retreat. Building seawalls, one potential solution, has the potential to damage vast area, and estimates are in the trillions of dollars to preserve large areas. In the southeastern United States alone, the study my colleagues and I did showed that approximately 3 million people are going to need to relocate given a 1 meter rise in sea level. So how do we address the loss of cultural resources moving forward? First, we need to continually refine our modeling efforts. The bathtub model that my colleagues and I did has been superseded by better models looking at rainfall and storm surge and others. We need to keep doing that. We need to conduct more excavations, more survey. We need to involve many more parties and people. We're all stakeholders in this. And a classic example is the South Carolina DNR's Poke Island Shell Ring archaeology project. We need to recognize that impacts aren't restricted just to coastal areas. Excessive rainfall and flooding can undercut banks along our major river systems. An example that I worked with was at the Shiloh National Battlefield. There was a major Indian mound group on the site that was being undercut by the Tennessee River and literally eroding into the river. A mitigation plan involves some 4,000 person days of field work at that site. You can see the scale of the excavations that took place. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to learn a lot of new things about the human past, as well as how to deal with large projects like this. One of the things we learned from this project was that the appearance of mounds built by First Peoples was quite different than we have assumed. So basically, they weren't green, grass-covered, short grass-covered monuments. They were quite probably colored in many cases. So we need to develop diverse and iterative approaches to our response. We need to ensure collaboration and participation by all the impacted parties. We need to consider a wide array of cultural and research concerns, decolonizing our practice and building our capacity. We need to consider multiple perspectives and multiple voices in planning, conducting the research, curation, and in reporting. We need to recognize our biases and what we consider significant sites. This is Louis Vork's wonderful paper showing that many World Heritage sites currently listed reflect hierarchical and not more traditional horizontal or egalitarian forms of socio-political organization. We need to recognize that mitigation must encompass a wide range of cultural resources. And a classic example of these things being done are on reservoir projects. This is one I worked with extensively about 40 years ago. So I'll be talking about it. Detailed plans are needed for climate change mitigation. The Russell Reservoir, before the fieldwork started, had a 3-volume, roughly 1,000-page mitigation plan. We need to be thinking about these things. It surveyed 210 square kilometers, finding about 1 site per 71 acres, and then a large numbers of these sites were examined. The cost of this program was about $5 million in 1980. These are slides of some of the excavations that took place, very traditional excavations. Some large scale, entire villages were examined late pre-contact. But there was also other site types considered, industrial archaeology, mill sites, for example. There was the architectural documentation of structures, and we remember the numbers. We're going to lose large numbers of structures in coastal areas. There was also oral history of groups that are traditionally not examined in such projects. There was also the relocation of structures. It won't just be the Cape Hatteras Light. There were bridges, there were houses, things like that were moved out of the flood pool. Unanticipated consequences. It became clear during the excavations and the related work that the Savannah River Valley was abandoned around 1450 AD. And subsequent research showed that climate change likely played a role. There was a decrease in rainfall associated with the emergence of fortifications and then the abandonment of sites in the area. So a global level of effort is needed in information management and planning, and I like to see the NOAA system in place, and we actually need this between all agencies and indeed the state site file managers as well in the US, and then of course going well beyond that. 2 of the projects I've been involved with are the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas and the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, where we're trying to integrate and index large numbers of sites. We need to design appropriate field procedures as well as analysis and reporting efforts. One of the very effective techniques that's come along is using LiDAR and other imaging directed to locating subtle elevational differences in coastal environments. You can see shell rings here, but they can also be used to find race dikes, roads, and other structures. Geoarchaeologically informed analyses directed to site discovery are also important. We can use LiDAR, again, in this case at the Shiloh battlefield, to fly and assess erosion conditions. We had LiDAR imagery of the mound that was falling into the river, and we're able to reconstruct, this was just a few years ago, reconstruct the extent of loss that had taken place since the mitigation. And we need to use remote sensing to prioritize excavations. This is houses around the plaza at the Etowah Mound Group in Georgia. Curation is a critical part of this. We need to make sure what is saved is maintained for the long term, and it has to be in secure facilities and areas well inland from the coast. The curation is for public education and research. It shouldn't just be stored, it should be accessed and used. So the results at every stage of the process should be publicly reported, widely shared, and guide subsequent stages. In the Russell Reservoir, we had technical syntheses that were produced of both the pre-contact and historic archaeology. There were also popular overviews produced in literally thousands of copies and distributed to schools throughout Georgia for both the archaeology and the oral history. So a big question is, how do we estimate the numbers of archaeological sites on lands threatened with sea level rise? Well, nearly 50,000 square kilometers will be lost in the southeast, given a 1 meter rise in sea level. This is a 500,000 site sample from the DINA database. And of course, some areas are much more intensely surveyed than others, typically federal lands where there are the resources to pay for those costs. This is the Francis Marion National Forest, for example. One of the things we can do is compare survey intensity and site incidents in threatened areas. On intensively surveyed federal lands, In a sample of the installations in the southeast, the average is about 1 site per 110 acres. These figures compared to the total number of recorded sites in the region. You can see that the numbers of acres per site, the fifth column over, is roughly between 600 and 700. So basically, the numbers of sites that are out there is probably 6 or 7 times as high as what we have already recorded, because the vast majority of the area has not been intensively surveyed and hence has a very low site incidence. The next question, how do we estimate what it would cost to survey and mitigate these, the loss of cultural heritage? Well, archaeological inventory survey costs vary widely, but a very rough ballpark based on studies that have been conducted is between $100 and $1,000 an acre for survey and evaluation. Now, doing the numbers, basically in terms of the acreage in the southeast, a rise of sea level of 1 meter, the cost would range at 100, about 1.2, and 1,000, 12.2 billion. And then, of course, as sea level rises beyond that, the costs increase. Now, another way to estimate mitigation costs is just to look at large projects that have happened in the past. The Russell Reservoir examined 215 square kilometers and cost $5 million in 1980 dollars, or roughly 16 million in today's dollars. Now, a 1 meter rise in sea level will submerge an area equivalent to nearly 250 of these reservoir projects across just the southeastern US alone. The Russell Reservoir project, again, $16 million today. We'd probably look at a lot more sites than we did then, so you can up that a bit, but that gives you a ballpark. So the southeastern coastal mitigation, based on a traditional archaeological model, is about $4 billion if we look at the numbers of potential projects, and that's in today's money. Now, given that sea level rise threatens coastal areas, and that's where people have been living for the last 6,000 years, as sea level has been relatively stable during that time, the actual cost of mitigation is likely to be several times higher. So I just said, let's multiply that by 3, and the figure comes out to about $12 billion. Now, this is amortized over the course of the next 50, 60 years. And in comparison, this is 0.06% of the proposed stimulus infrastructure bill. So amortized over a long period of time, it isn't really that much money if we again use a traditional archaeological model. And if we double the numbers, it's still not a lot compared to what we are spending currently per year. So to conclude, there's no doubt that climate change poses tremendous challenges for archaeologists and indeed for our civilization. I think it's our greatest challenge this century is to get through it with a stable civilization and a well-preserved heritage. We've faced these challenges before. There are over 8,100 major dam sites that have been built in the United States in the last 150 years. And many of them had cultural resource investigations, not as complete as in the Russell Reservoir, which is one of the last ones built, but we have done this before. So I believe we can meet this challenge, we will meet it, but we need to be planning accordingly and thinking in terms of the scale and integrating information over large areas. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Anderson. Seeing climate change and its impacts on maritime heritage from the perspective of Southeastern United States was very meaningful and interesting. Do you all have any questions? If so, please put them in the chat box. We have many compliments saying thank you very much for a great presentation.
I appreciate that, and thank you again for inviting me. And it's a great series of talks, so I appreciate that, the opportunity. And again, if people would like the slides, and I want you to know I've cut this talk in about half from what I gave at the Cultural Heritage at Risk session in January, so I can give full versions of the talks, email them to anybody who would like, and it will be recorded and available. So thank you again.
There is a question, and it's, have there been any studies as to where populations may move, have moved, and how this impacts sites in the areas to which they move?
Yes, great question. There are studies of migration, anticipated migration patterns that have been undertaken. Now, how this affects cultural resources has not been undertaken, but you can basically assume that if large numbers of people are moving inland, the areas they leave behind will need to be evaluated and salvaged, rescued, triaged in some way. And then the areas where they move to will see increased development. So that's something that people will be thinking of. Again, we haven't been really planning on a beyond an agency or state basis on this, and we really need to combine a lot of informatics, a lot of information, and a lot of thinking. And as someone in the last talk said, we need groups like this to be discussing these issues.
Very nice, very interesting as well. Another question is, with regard to the cost of mitigation versus construction, do you have a central fund for archaeological mitigation in advance of construction in the USA?
Well, under the National Historic Preservation Act, as modified in 1974, up to 1% of any federally funded, licensed, or backed project can go to the evaluation and mitigation of cultural resources that might be impacted by that project. So that is one source of funding. And indeed, the National Historic Preservation Act and the Historic Preservation Fund, which results in the funding of many state offices and mandates action by, again, federal agencies. We heard the NOAA people previously talk about how they follow it. There are funding mechanisms there. However, in the 1960s and 70s, what archaeologists did and heritage resource managers, I guess you could say, was they made a concerted effort to ensure that cultural resources were included in what was called then the crisis in American archaeology, the large numbers of sites that were being lost. I think we need a similar effort. And indeed, with the new infrastructure bill, for example, we have to ensure that cultural resources are considered, that they aren't short-circuited or ignored. And fortunately, with the legislative mandate, that's very unlikely to happen.
Great. Another question is, are there any examples of prioritization for selecting cultural sites for evaluation for climate change already being attempted, perhaps FEMA?
Yeah, the Federal Emergency Management Administration and other agencies responsible for things like oil spill mitigation and so on. Oftentimes large areas are impacted and a form of assessment and triage, and then mitigation has to occur. Again, this has been done in some areas and at some scales, but not at the scale we need, given that the climate change is affecting resources across the planet, from the Arctic to coastal areas. So it's a great question. We need to be thinking about that, and that's one reason why my colleagues and I built the Digital Index of North American Archaeology. It's an informatics platform. The software is open access. Anybody can take it and build on it. It's a model for integrating archaeological data and pointing to other data sets out there. And you're welcome to take it and use it or link to it. So we need to be thinking on those levels.
Very interesting. Is there any other questions? We do have a few more minutes to address any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you again very much. It's a great session, and I again appreciate participating in it.
Well, thank you for coming and presenting. It was very meaningful. Our next presenter is Miss Christina Gaithel. She is a PhD candidate and researcher at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. She will be speaking on the effects of ocean acidification on Pacific Arctic bivalves and implications for maritime heritage. So if you would like to share your screen, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
First slide.
Yeah, we can see your slide.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you, McKenna, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk today. I had the pleasure of instructing McKenna in Intro to Environmental Science at St. Mary's College. So I was really thankful that she invited me to come talk here today. I'm going to start off and preface that I am an ecologist. So archaeology and maritime heritage is not really in my areas of expertise or wheelhouse, but I was really excited to kind of take what I do know about ecosystem science in the Arctic and apply it in thinking about what those implications for maritime heritage might be. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from people that this is more their level of expertise. So to start off, why the Arctic? And just to introduce you to the Arctic. So the Arctic is a unique system. It's an ocean surrounded by land. So it's almost as if we might be looking at a map of the Chesapeake Bay. And so this is pretty unique to an ocean system. There's 8 Arctic nations, Canada, Alaska, Canada, the United States, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, and Russia. And then what we call 6 permanent participants. And so these are the indigenous groups in the region. And they're listed there. So this is to kind of show that this is a area where all kinds of people are working together to protect this ecosystem. And the Arctic, you know, why we study the Arctic and why I particularly study the Arctic, it's one system, and therefore connections, both physical and cultural, across regions need to be made to protect the system as a whole. So I kind of think more about the physical and ecological. And when I think about cultural in my work, usually I'm thinking about how we can incorporate indigenous knowledge and work together in the ecosystem that they live in. But in this context, for this meeting, is really interesting to think about other cultural resources like shipwrecks, one of which I'm going to focus on in a little bit. But the Arctic is rapidly changing. So air temperatures are increasing at almost twice the speed of the global average. So the blue line in this graph from 1900s to 2020, the blue line is north of the Arctic Circle, so 60 degrees north, and the red line is global. And so these are air temperatures. Water temperatures, the same thing. So I work with benthic organisms, or organisms that live in the mud and on the bottom. And so when I talk about water temperatures, it's almost always going to be bottom water temperatures. But one example in the US Arctic is in the northern Bering Sea. We've had temperatures that are 1.5 to 2 degrees higher than previously recorded from Dr. Jackie Grebmeyer, who's been monitoring the system in a time series capacity for the last 30 years. So this is a really rapidly changing system, and one that we can learn from in other areas of the world. So why ocean acidification in the Pacific? So I've kind of set up that this is a unique system. It's expected to feel effects earlier than other regions for some reasons that I'm going to get into on the next slide. And there's already been seasonal measurements of ocean acidification events. And when thinking about this, there's kind of 3 buzzwords that, at least in the Arctic, we use. We like to think about the duration. So how long are these ocean acidification events happening? The intensity of these events. So what are some of the saturation states and decreased pHs? What are we measuring? How intense are they? And then the resiliency of the system. So how is the system responding? Is it able to bounce back? Are animals responding? How are they responding? Are there ones that are responding better than others? And what might that mean for the ecosystem as a whole? So one of the first reasons to think about ocean acidification in the Pacific Arctic is it's cold. Gases like CO2 are more soluble in into cold water, so it's going to more readily absorb into the system. this thing called ficus, which stands for phytoplankton carbonate saturation state. And I'm going to go into that on the next slide a little bit better. Organic matter export and remineralization. So this is a picture of what the bottom in Alaska might look like. We've got worm tubes, clams, and crustaceans that live on the bottom. Again, this is going to connect back to our ficus in a diagram on our next slide. And then river freshwater input. So this decreases the alkalinity in a system, and the Arctic has a lot of major rivers that flow into it. And I'm not gonna focus too much on this, but it is one of the things that causes this system to be pretty unique when thinking about ocean acidification. So ficus and thinking about that remineralization that I said. So this is kind of a simplified diagram of what goes on in the Chukchi Sea and the Pacific Arctic. So you have CO2 entering the system from the atmosphere at the air-sea interface, and this dissolved inorganic carbon and nutrients get used by phytoplankton. So they're taking it up and producing oxygen. So you end up with, in the surface waters, you end up with low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, but an increased pH and omega saturation state, which is the state at which animals that make shells are going to be able to produce those shells. However, in this system, all of that material, it's not grazed upon on organisms in the water column. And so what happens is it drops to the bottom and ends up down on the shelf, where we have a lot of animals like clams and worms, and they're remineralizing it. So they're using this CO2, or they're using oxygen and reworking things in the sediment. And what that creates is the opposite of what we see in the surface water. So a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide and a suppressed pH in omega state. And so when the animals that are going to be calcifying and creating shells that might be at the biggest risk from this decreased pH are living in an environment where that's happening. And when we think about this in the context of maritime heritage, these shipwrecks and stuff are going to be sitting at the bottom where this suppressed pH is located. So why thinking about biological consequences, particularly in the Arctic? So the Bering Sea Fishery, 40% of all finfish and shellfish landings in the United States come from the Bering Sea, as well as over 25 million pounds of subsistence foods. So as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of native communities in this region, and they rely on the ocean. I've worked with a woman who gives presentations about how the ocean is their grocery store. These animals on the right-hand side are some of the ones that might be most affected. So pteropods, which have small shells. These are little snails that live in the water column, crabs, different species of crabs, and then clams, which I'm going to talk about, which are the picture you see in the background. These are all important prey items for walruses, bearded seals, and diving sea ducks. This is a spectacled eider, which is a threatened bird species. And they all feed on organisms that calcify, and then these are the subsistence items for these communities. And so some studies to date, a lot of people have looked at these pteropods. Another connection there is that pteropods make up about 40% of a salmon's diet. So if anyone's ever had Alaskan salmon, they're also fed by pteropods. Tanner and red king crabs, so those are these two crabs on this side. Pollock, which is a big fishery, and then bivalves, which is my specialty. Additionally, there's economic consequences. This is a map of Alaska and an analysis that looked at risk and of ocean acidification effects on commercially important species. So these red areas are where high risk is expected. The yellow areas are medium, and then more inland, there's a lower risk. And so thinking all about these coastal communities, which is where a lot of these indigenous communities are located. You have Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, Nome up in this area, and then Barrow or Ukti-Avik, as it's now known, up in this area. So there's also an economic consequence when we think about ocean acidification. So I did a study where I looked at common clams and what their effects, what ocean acidification might do to them. I used three common species, two common genuses in the region. And so just a little bit about them. Unfortunately, they don't really have common names, so I'll be using the Latin names throughout the talk. But Macoma calcarea, There's actually a species in the Chesapeake Bay near where I'm located that's the same genus. So this is a pretty ubiquitous genus throughout the world. So they're about 35 to 50 millimeters. The ones that I used in this experiment fell within that range, some a little bit smaller. They're deposit and suspension feeders, so they're using material in the mud, and they're eating material in the mud as deposit feeders, but they are able to suspension feed, which means they're pulling things directly out of the water column. They have pelagic larvae, so what this means is that they're living in, their larvae or their young are in the water column before they settle out into the benthic ecosystem. The form of calcium carbonate that they use to create their shells is aragonite, which is the more susceptible form to ocean acidification dissolution. And as I said, they're a prey base for benthic feeding organisms in a variety of areas in the Pacific Arctic. The other two species that I used are the same genus. They're the Astartes genus. And I looked at Montegui and Borealis. Montegui are smaller. They're generally the smaller ones. They're these four that are lined up right here. And then Borealis are much larger. They are both suspension feeders, so they're using material from the water column. They have pelagic larvae just like the Macoma, and they're also using aragonite as their form of calcium carbonate. So the Pacific Arctic is a benthic dominated system. So what that means is this part, the sea floor, has a rich biomass and abundance of animals. We get this ice edge bloom, that material I was talking about in the surface waters that falls to the bottom and feeds these animals. However, with changing conditions, so this is how it's set up currently, is you have ice algae production and phytoplankton that feeds the benthos, which is then feeding things like certain demersal fish species, gray whales and bearded seals, walruses, and diving ducks. But with changing conditions, so those warming seawater temperatures, as well as ocean acidifications, is increasing this zooplankton growth, abundance, and grazing. And so that's starting to match better with the time of the blooms, and less food is being deposited to the bottom. And so we might see kind of a shift in this ecosystem where zooplankton become more dominant. We're feeding a different group of upper level trophic, and we get a much smaller benthos. So now they're getting hit with stressors like ocean acidification, but also potentially less food, which could give them the energy reserves to try and combat stressors like ocean acidification. And that's gonna, you'll see that in some of the experiments I'm gonna show in a second. So I brought back these clams from the Arctic and held them in a cold room set to these conditions at the Chesapeake Biological Lab. This is a conceptual diagram of how this was set up. So we had this whiteboard that had these pH controllers that were connected to a tank of carbon dioxide, and you're able to set the values that you want. And there's a system of valves that if the values aren't hit, it'll open the valve and allow CO2 gas to be bubbled into the tanks to maintain the desired pH condition. I did this for two sets of experiments, one that was run for 7 weeks and one that was run for 11 weeks. In the first set of experiments, all of the tanks had food, so working under the assumption that it was still a benthic dominated system. And then in the second set of experiments, I had some tanks that were fed and some that had limited food exposure to mimic what a more pelagic ecosystem might look like. And so then these bubbled into these big, what we called header tanks. And from that header tank, I used that water to maintain the pH levels in the smaller tanks that held the clams. And so like I said, and we ran two sets of experiments. And so thinking about the duration, this first set was run for 7 weeks and everything was fed. And then in 2016, we had some that were fed and some that were not fed, and it was run for 11 weeks. Within each tank, I had 6 Macomas in the first set of experiments, 1 Borealis. That's just because we didn't collect as many, and so I had to work with what I had. And then 8 of the Montague species. And then in 2016, during the longer experiment, there was death and availability of clams, and so 3 of the Macoma was able to use 2 Borealis and then 7 of the Montagues. And again, I keep driving this home, but the 7 weeks and the 11 weeks for this duration. So what happened? So in our short experiment, I was using length and weight, and and metabolic demand, which I'm not going to show here, but I was using length and weight as measurements of response to the stress. So this first left-hand column is going to be the Macomas, the middle column is the Montagues, and the right-hand column is the Borealis. And then looking at the percent change in length and the percent change in weight. So in the Macomas for percent change in length after 7 weeks, the acidified did see a larger percent change in length, excuse me, than the control. However, they both declined. This is probably an artifact of the fact that they're being held in an artificial environment. And you can see in the 2 Astartes species, there was pretty negligible change. In fact, both of them had positive change. So this means that they grew. In the weight, both of them declined in Macomas, and there was not really a significant difference. It was hard to tease apart if there was any kind of effect from the acidified environment. And then again, in the 2 Astartes species, both of them were positive and kind of negligible. However, in 2016, so this was the experiment run for 11 weeks, and this is where I started to manipulate food. So food is giving them energy resources to hopefully try and combat some of the stress. So if they have the available resources, they can pump those into shell creation, even if the conditions aren't ideal. So these A's and B's just show significance. And so in Macoma in length, so proxy for growth, the only one that had a positive change in growth was those that were fed and those that were living in a food-rich environment. Both acidified treatments and the control treatment that were not fed had negative impacts to length. In percent change of weight, they had positive, so there was growth somewhere. More work would be needed to tease apart kind of why the weight was changing and length, why they were changing differently. In the Montagues, again, everything was kind of positive and negligible. So these seem to be a pretty resilient species to this stressor in the environment. Borealis had the strongest effect. So both control organisms had positive percent change in length, while the acidified had a negative percent change. So here there was a kind of a clear impact to the acidified conditions for this species. So we concluded that this Borealis was less resilient than than the other 2. So to kind of just wrap that all up, after 11 weeks, so again, thinking about this duration, effects were seen between control groups and acidified groups of the 2 clams. The intensity between both years was kept the same for consistency's sake. One of the biggest things in ocean acidification research is that there are species-specific responses. And so this demonstrates that there's different resiliencies to the effects of these ocean acidification events. So we might have winners and losers in the system, which could have cascading effects for higher trophic levels. And food in the system is a really big driving factor. This has been shown over and over again in the Pacific Arctic, particularly for the benthic biomass. And so that can play a role in their responses. Like I said, energetics. If they have the resources to overpower some of the stressors, then there's less likely to have potential effects. And this kind of quote just kind of sums up the work that's done in the Pacific Arctic, where anthropogenic carbon dioxide additions act as a relatively small contributor currently, but undersaturations are occurring during the summer and fall. And if it continues to accumulate under what our business as usual, the duration and intensity of these events are going to increase. And so organisms are going to be exposed to a longer period of these corrosive conditions. And so what that might mean for maritime heritage in the Arctic is a relatively new, what we call new area of exploration. This is an example of some people that did the first things in the Arctic. So, 1826, while it might seem kind of far away, for a lot of other regions of the world, this is relatively recent history. So Frederick Beechey explored the Alaskan coast from Point Barrow to the Bering Strait. So that's the region that I currently am working in. In 1893, Nansen, a famous Norwegian, designed his ship to be frozen in pack ice, hoping to end up at the North Pole. There's some discussion as to who reached the geographic North Pole first. Robert Peary is credited with that more broadly. And then we only had the first air expedition to the North Pole as recently as 1926. And one of the most famous ones was the Franklin expedition. And so These are two really famous shipwrecks that were just recently found. So Franklin was a British explorer. He left England in 1845 to try and navigate through parts of the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic that hadn't yet been explored. He had two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and these became trapped in the ice near King William Island, which I'll show you on a map in a second, with a total of 129 men. Franklin died, and the survivors abandoned the ships in 1848 and set out for the mainland, but were lost at sea. And so this is kind of where this happened. He came in looking to get through the Northwest Passage up in the Canadian archipelago, and he got lost in this region. Admundsen was able to come in, who's another Norwegian, and do the same thing, but successfully about 20 years later. And so this is where these were abandoned. And then in 2014 and 2016, the two ships were found. So this is the wreck of the Terror, and this is the wreck of the Erebus. And so they were found in 2014 and 2016 by Canadian Parks Canada. And what's kind of cool about this for me is I have a personal connection. A lot of my work is conducted on the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, which is a Canadian Coast Guard vessel. And they were the primary support vessel for finding these two wreckages. So I think this is a really nice example of kind of this interdisciplinary work where you get scientists doing ecological studies, chemical oceanography, physical oceanography studies, and we're using the same ships that are then being deployed by archaeologists and park systems to find wreckages like this. And so I was perusing the pictures of these sites, and so to just leave you with what the conditions that these ships were found in. And to kind of draw it all together, I started this saying that the Arctic was one system, and therefore connections, both physical and cultural, across the regions need to be made to protect the system as a whole. And that does include the maritime history and heritage of exploration in this region, and shipwreck sites like the Erebus and the Terror. This quote kind of highlights the interdisciplinary nature of this. So Parks Canada discovered the Erebus in 2014, but it was an area that they knew to go look at and had been identified by Inuit, the indigenous groups in the region. And then 2 years later, the Terror was located using that same historical research, Inuit knowledge, and the support of other partners. And then this idea of duration, intensity, and resiliency. Through those experiments I showed you, we saw the effects in the biology, and that has the capacity to protect potentially the protection of maritime sites. So I was looking at time periods of 7 to 11 weeks, and these wrecks are sitting down there for hundreds of years. And so as these stressing events like ocean acidification events increase in that duration and the conditions are intensifying, there's some potential increasing impacts to things that aren't just biologically important in the system. And so with that, these are just a lot of the people that have been involved in my parts of the work. And I can take any questions, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to present today. It was really interesting to see the connection between ocean acidification and its impacts on not only bivalves, but also maritime heritage, like shipwrecks in the Arctic region. If you guys have any questions, please enter them into the chat box. Oh, we already have one. Did you see any thinning of the shells in your experiments?
So I wanted to measure thinning, and I never got a chance to. We were kind of hoping we could arm wave a little bit and use weight as a proxy for that, but unfortunately I didn't weigh the shell separate from the organic matter, the animal part of it. There is a group in Japan that looks at thinning of shells using a high intensity microscope that I sent some shells off to have analyzed from these experiments, and those images did show that there was thinning closest to the parts that were exposed directly to the water.
All right, our next question is, have the lifeways and knowledge of the Inuit played a role in your studies in the Arctic?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't be in the Arctic without that affecting everything from making sure that you're up collecting samples outside of hunting season. So we have to submit paperwork and plans and ask if we can be in certain regions. Hunting season is usually in the fall, September, October. But there are research cruises going out, especially as the ice retreats and pulls back. More and more ships are going through there in September and October. For me, clams are my specialty. And as I said, they feed these upper trophic level animals. And the best understanding I have of the importance of that is from talking with Inuit and indigenous folks in the region. And so, yeah, it's an integral part. Going up there, you kind of can't, not that I would want to, but you can't escape utilizing their knowledge.
Any other questions for our wonderful presenters? All right, well, I think that since we have a little bit more time, we're going to open it up to an additional 15-minute question and answer session for all of our presenters that have spoke so far today. Just give them a chance to answer all of your questions and thoughtful comments. And then after this question and answer period, we will take a short break and then begin our next presentation at 8:30 EDT time with Dr. David Gregory. So we will pause the recording for this break. So feel free to chat amongst yourselves either through the chat box, or you can unmute yourselves and use your microphone. But for now, are there any questions for all of the presenters that have presented so far? Oh yes, 8:30 EDT. That is when our next presentation is supposed to take place. I'm so sorry. I was just informed that I keep saying 8:30 instead of 11:30. It's 11:30 EDT that our next presentation is supposed to take place. So sorry about that. But we do have a question, and it's, how do the presenters feel citizen science figures into their programs and or future?
I think we saw from a number of the presentations that we need all the help we can get from as many sources of as possible. And the work in Scotland in particular and in the UK is just remarkable in terms of the help from citizens. The same is being done in Florida, the Florida Public Archaeology Network and the Heritage at Risk group. So those are just two classic examples of how citizen science, I guess you could say, is a part of it. And every field project I've been on for the last 40, 50 years has had volunteers. I make it a point to try to write provisions into the budget to pay for volunteers for helping in public outreach and interpretation. So I think it's tremendously important. I'll stop there, turn it over to other folks.
Yeah, I'll just chime in too. I don't know specific examples in the Arctic, but I do know it's becoming more and more common in the polar regions. There's a huge effort, citizen science effort in Antarctica, identifying phytoplankton down there, especially as tourism in Antarctica starts to open up. But yeah, we rely on so many different, I've been out to sea with volunteers. You know, I would say ours comes probably more from indigenous people that live in the area, but I guess that's also citizen science. That's where they live. So
Yeah, for some reason I'm up as Joanna Hamby now. But yeah, obviously it's very important for us here in Scotland, not only because of the very real help that we can get, especially from people after storms and after natural events who live on maybe more islands that are a bit further away and not so easy to get to. They can get straight out there, straight after a storm, because we have many cases where things are uncovered during a storm and then the sand will just pile back in again and cover it up. So having eyes and ears on the ground and letting us know and take photographs straight away is a great help. But also there's the political element as well. By having local citizens involved, it means quite often that the local politicians get quite interested in the case as well. And we do have examples, well, 2 of our projects, including that Weems one that I showed you earlier today, but 2 of our groups have actually been to the Scottish Parliament and given presentations to our politicians in the Parliament talking about climate change and heritage at risk. So I think it's absolutely essential.
And I forgot to mention my colleagues at South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, some of whom are here today. The Poke Island shell ring mitigation is just remarkable. It has a wide host of volunteers, as well as collaboration between a number of agencies. So that's another good example. You can go online and look and see how a project like that is affecting a site that's literally being washed away by storm surge.
And we did receive a question about when the recordings for this conference will be available. They will be available shortly after the conclusion of the second session of the conference, which is going to take place tomorrow evening, Eastern Daylight Time, but it should take place during the day, Australian time. That is when they will become available. They'll be available. I will share them with you via email, and I will also be posting them to the new Marine Science major website for St. Mary's College of Maryland, and I can provide you with that link as well. Our next question is, actually, Rosalind would like to ask a question on video. So would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Tom. Thank you for your presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. And I've been looking into World Heritage status of the zenith of Iron Age Shetland and before Neolithic organisms. So it was totally up my street. So what I wanted to ask was, and I'm sorry, I had to pop away for a meeting, so I'm really sorry if this has been covered. Have you found that funding was increased for the sites which have been identified as high risk? And also I'd like to ask about how you managed to find members of the community, especially in Scotland, because I need to do that and it's quite intimidating. So two different questions there. Thank you for your time.
Hey, hi there. And thanks for following us on Twitter. Yes, so with the funding, what happened when we wrote the report, I should start off. We've been working with HES, Historic Environment Scotland, very closely right from the beginning. So that's 21 years now we've been working with them. And when we wrote the report on prioritization, the team that manages the archaeology budget have been using that report. So when people come in with proposals for work, they are using that in order to help prioritize the funding. So there is a set budget within Scotland, as you probably know, for archaeological work. Now that you've got far more chance that if your site is one of the sites at risk, which is being threatened by climate change, and obviously it fits in with all the other the SCARF proposals and things like that. But as long as you fit in with all of those things, you're more likely to get the funding. We also found that once we had identified a project, because we would be able to quite often get seed funding from Historic Environment Scotland. And I should also mention here in Scotland, we have a thing called in the UK, we have a thing called the Heritage Lottery Fund. It's changed its name now, but basically it's a fund where people play the lottery and the profits from that are redistributed for heritage projects. Because we had that money in the first place, it meant that it became easier to apply for additional funding, because if you've got, say, 70% of the funding you already need, people think that the project is more likely to be a goer rather than starting with no funding at all. So that really, really helped. And then your other question was how to find communities. Yes, so the way we've been doing that is, and this is something that we started right back in 2000, it would be through newspapers, putting in an advert in the local newspaper saying, we're giving a talk in the local village hall. And I can remember giving a talk on Tyree right back in about 2001, and they put 6 chairs out in the hall and said, I doubt you're going to get more than 6 people. And I think there was 60 or 70 turned up on a very, very small island. So quite often there is a lot of interest, especially in the winter as well. And you might not think that, but there might not be so much to do in the winter. So, and the nights are dark, so people are more likely to come out. But now obviously we use social media or other ways, but we always hold a talk. We try and get people to come together as a community, and then we try to organize events as well. So we'll hold a talk and then go out and do something. And then from that, you're quite often able to identify people who might be willing to lead a group. And then after that, you keep in communication with them and help set up the groups. Did that help?
It definitely did. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We have another question in the chat, and it's asking, when the public is involved in projects, are there concerns for managing sensitive archaeological data, such as site location information, and what steps are taken to protect that information?
One thing that my colleagues and I in the DINA project, Digital Index of North American Archaeology, we have been linking together site file data from across the United States. But one of the things we do is maintain that information at 20-kilometer resolution. And if people want to get the exact locations, they have to contact the site file managers in the states in question. It's actually a violation of federal law and in some cases state law to reveal specific information, locational and in some cases other sensitive information. So we're very concerned about following those legal guidelines.
This is something that we actually run into a lot within the sanctuary system, is that people either reach out with requests for information, and usually that's in the FOIA request or a freedom of information request, or we have individuals who are out actively diving in our sanctuaries who come to us and say, hey, I found this resource, or I'm interested in looking at this. And so because this is so frequent, we actually have guidance from the National Historic Preservation Act, which is section 304, addressing release of site information. And as we've built out these policy guidance documents, one of the things that we've returned to, and it's actually gone through our formal clearance process, is that section 304 guidance for NOAA and how it relates to our sharing of information, because these are federally managed sites. And so I'd be happy to share that with you. But I know that one of the things that we frequently come across is a consideration of that site status. Is it publicly known? Does it have sensitive information? Is it protected? And is it on the National Register? Does it have associated Native, Indigenous, or tribal engagement aspects or pieces of data? And sort of mechanism we often use is we have formal memorandums of agreement or understanding that we draw up with interested parties that outline sort of our relationship with them, how this data is, if there are certain aspects that are sensitive, and that we come up with a formal agreement with our research partners in asking for either pieces of information not to be shared with the public, or if there's pieces of sensitive information that govern how that information is shared by NOAA or by the research partner. And so I know that that's something that we frequently use as those formal agreements or understandings.
Here in the United Kingdom, we have a very different system. So we are allowed to make the data public, and indeed Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland and Ireland, they all have their own databases which show the locations of every archaeological site. In some ways, this gets over the problem of people having an archaeological site on their land and not actually realizing that it's there and accidentally doing some damage to it. And over the years, I've had many, many conversations with my colleagues in America about this system, and some people are worried that if you make the information available, that the site is going to get looted. Other people have the opinion that if people knew that there was an archaeological site there and they saw people acting in a dodgy way, sort of with metal detectors or sneaking around at nighttime, that they're more likely to be able to tell the police because they actually are aware of what it is that these people are up to, who are going around looting the sites. So yes, we are allowed to make the data available. And I'm not sure, but I think that Joe might be talking about the differences between the approaches here in the United Kingdom and in the United States at a talk which Sarah has highlighted in the chat, because Joe will be talking to Naha at Flagler College on Friday. So that was a little plug for Joe.
Another presentation in the chat is addressed to Christina, and it says, your work has had a focus on measuring pH. I was wondering what your thoughts are on cheaper publicly available pH meters. Here in England, we are looking at monitoring pH on wreck sites and having data submitted by citizen scientists, and we are hoping to supply them with these pH meters. Do you think they are up for the task?
That's a really good question. Yes and no. So I think, the ones I was using were not, they were pretty sophisticated. They do make, I think like Fisher Science, Cole Parmer, there's quite a few of them that make kind of more intuitive and handheld meters that I think would be good for citizen science and for citizens using. The ocean acidification world sometimes with data can be pretty stringent on how things are measured and what they want measured. So when you're quantifying the carbonate system, a lot of there's 3 parameters that people can measure, which saturation state, pH, and alkalinity. And they almost always want 2 parameters. So I would say if there are other parameters getting measured and pH is also getting used, then it's absolutely there are friendly ones out there for volunteers to use and add that to a data set. I think if only pH data from volunteers is being used, there might be some pushback from a more formal the more formal community in ocean acidification research. I've actually kind of taken a step back from ocean acidification community because I'm not a chemist, and there was a lot of that kind of stringent chemistry that they wanted. But I hope that answers the question. I know it was kind of back and forth, but I would say yes, as long as there's some additional data that's provided if the hope is to have it published or used to help make decisions.
We have about 3 more minutes for questions and answers for our presenters. So if you guys have any additional questions, you could put it in the chat box, or if you would like to speak in person, you can also do that. All right, since there are no additional questions, we are going to take a break. We will pause the recording and then resume the recording back at 11:30 EDT time. And yes, have a great break. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves via the chat box, or you can unmute yourself once the recording ends. So I'll see you soon. All right, welcome back everybody from your break. I hope that it was a nice break. Our next presenter is Dr. David Gregory, and he is a senior researcher and visiting research professor with the National Museum of Denmark. He will be speaking on the implication of climate change on the spread of wood-boring organisms that affects underwater cultural heritage.
Thank you very much, McKenna. Sorry, I've still got COVID hair, unlike Dr. Broadwater. I'll just try sharing my screen for the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, just got to try and turn my screen off now. Yes, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening. And once again, McKenna, thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation on some of the work we've been doing in the past and actually at the moment, looking at the effects of climate change and the threats to underwater cultural heritage by wood-boring organisms underwater. Sorry, I need to. Is that better? Hopefully. As we've seen from Christina's presentation with the HMS Terror and Erebus, and also in Thunder Bay, that we can have particularly fantastic preservation underwater. This is a typical shipwreck that we might find in the Baltic Sea, where we've been working. And we generally look at two different environments, the open seawater or the seabed, and we'll have very different processes affecting our wooden shipwrecks. If we look in the open seawater, we'll have physical deterioration caused by scour due to the effects of currents. But one of the main threats we have are the biological activity of wood borers. Christina was also talking about bivalves, but we also have crustaceans that can be active in open seawater. I won't be talking about it today, but even in the seabed, we have much better preservation conditions still because we have no oxygen there, so we'll only have very slow deterioration caused by bacteria. Looking at the kinds of organisms that can be affecting our materials, wood, we have shipworm, Teredo nivalis we see here, pterodids, or we have the commonly called gribble or limnorids. And these can only operate in or be active in open seawater where there's dissolved oxygen present. They have to have a certain degree of salinity and temperature. These organisms have actually had a lot of focus on their ecology and study because they have very large economic effects. In the past, looking at shipping, that's why we've had copper sheeting and lead sheeting on the hulls of ships to prevent their activity, but also still in harbours where wooden piling foundations in harbours and in the marine environment, they will actively degrade these foundations. Another thing that we've actually been noticing in recent years, which could be due to climate change, are these appropriately named boring piddox, or they're the group of organisms called the pholads. The shipworm and the gribble, they actually utilize the wood as part of their metabolism. But with the boring piddox, they actually like to use the wood as a substrate. We often see, and this is a prehistoric site in Denmark, 7,000 years old, Neolithic site, where we've got the remains of fish traps. And they, even though they don't utilize the wood, they actually can bore through the sediments. This is a very thick clay gutcher type of sediment. And if there's archaeology present, they can actually bore through the wood as well. So what I really wanted to spend most of the talk about is looking at a project we had running about 10 years ago, which was looking at the threat of the particularly Teredo nivalis, the shipworm, in the Baltic Sea as a result of climate change. You can see the project homepage here, and it ran between 2009 and 2011 and was funded by the European Union. As Christina was also mentioning earlier in her talk, that we need to have a lot of interdisciplinary work, not just working as marine archaeologists, but the whole range of ocean sciences need to be involved in our work. So the consortium was a mixture of marine archaeologists, specialists in GIS and modeling. We had archaeological conservators with us, specialists in wood degradation in the marine environment, geochemists, and marine biologists. So the Baltic, we can see Denmark here, which is where I'm working, but we see Denmark very much as the gateway to the Baltic. We can see Sweden, Finland, Eastland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Germany all have borders with the Baltic Sea. And it's estimated that there's over 100,000 wrecks in the sea. Hopefully you can see on this slide a lot of small red dots. And these are all known documented wrecks. And in recent years, if you've heard of the Gazprom pipelines, there's 2 pipelines which are coming from Russia into Germany, and they've found more, over 200 new wrecks as part of this. And you can read more about a lot of the wrecks that have been found in the Baltic on the Routelers project, and there's a home page here as well. But the kind of wrecks that we're finding, hopefully people are familiar with the Vasa wreck, which is was excavated from Stockholm Harbour and exhibited in Stockholm. But certainly in connection with the Gazprom and other investigations, we're finding a lot of these, what I call Donald Duck wrecks, that are sitting up right on the seabed. And say in the last 10 years, there's been upwards of 200 kind of wrecks that are sitting on the seabed like this. But why are wrecks so well preserved in the Baltic? And the main reason is because the shipworm can't survive. Here we can see a typical shipworm casing. When the shipworm bore into the wood, they line the tunnels they create with calcium carbonate. And this is one of the a shipworm taken out of its home. Here we can see the 2 valves. It's a bivalve at the anterior end, the head end, which it bores into the wood. And at the posterior end, we have 2 valves, which it can use to close the entrance hole from the wood, and it sends out siphons where it takes in water for its respiration. But the main reason they don't survive in the Baltic is because of the low salinity. So just to say a little bit about the life cycle of the shipworm, I say it is a bivalve mussel, a very specially adapted bivalve. It's a filter feeder. Even though it does have symbiotic bacteria in its gut that it can utilize cellulose, it actually gets its nutrition from the seawater. So it puts out these 2 siphons, and it takes in water, extracts nutrients, and then throws its waste products out. Now, worldwide, there are 65 known species of shipworm, and in Denmark and in the Baltic, we have 3 species: Teredo norvegica, Teredo megatora, and the main active organism is Teredo nivalis. But exposed wood can degrade very quickly. We often use these small pine test blocks, which are basically candy for shipworm. There's no preservatives in these, but when we expose them in areas where there are active shipworm present, we can see after 3 months they have been totally degraded. We often use X-ray to actually identify the presence of the shipworm. As I showed previously, they line their tunnels with calcium carbonate, which shows up very nicely in X-ray. And this is what we'll often see, the classic sort of herringbone remains of a shipwreck, where you've just got the framing that is sticking out of the seabed, which is surviving. But there was been concern from, as Tom was saying, with his work on the coastal sites, there's been a lot of concern about how the environment is changing due to, when I started, it was global warming and we were concerned about holes in the ozone layer. But back in the 80s, 1990s and early 2000s, we could see there were more shipworm coming into Danish and German waters down here. So it was a question, are they spreading into the Baltic Sea? The potential reasons for the spread are there's been a lot of movement to improve pollution, water quality in the Baltic. So was it the fact that we were creating cleaner water, that it was producing conditions that were conducive for the shipworm? Was it invasive species from ballast water from ships, or was it environmental changes as a result of climate change, and in particular temperature and salinity? So basically the project had two main themes, which was to investigate the spread of shipworm through modelling of the environmental parameters that affect the ecology of shipworm, and identify hotspots where shipworm may appear in the future. And then we're also trying to look at methods that have been used to protect wood underwater. As I've mentioned, a lot of harbour installations have been affected, and historically ships have also been affected. So could we apply some of these methods to protecting shipwrecks in situ, which is very much in line with certainly the UNESCO Convention for the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. So the parameters required for shipworm survival are specifically the temperature, dissolved oxygen in the water, salinity, water currents, and primary production of plankton. Now, knowledge of the limits of these parameters in relation to the production and growth of, we need to consider both the larvae, so the young juvenile shipworm, how they can actually move in the water, but then once the adults are formed and have settled in a piece of wood and then start reproducing, what parameters affect those? So we're looking at things that are happening on the seabed, but also in the water column. So where we started was using a model to collect data, which wasn't openly available at the time. It's quite a well-known Mike 3 model, which was developed by the Danish Hydraulic Institute, and it's used in a lot of environmental studies. So they're taking data that's been collected around Europe from governmental organizations, and they can collate this and create a model which has a horizontal resolution of 9 sea miles in the northern part of the Baltic, but when we're down in Bornholm around here, it was down to about 2 sea miles. And the vertical resolution depth-wise was about 2 meters. Now, the model takes into account meteorology, so atmospheric conditions, water currents, rainfall, and water levels. And then the model is validated using measured data, which we can see here, and there's more up in the northern part of the Baltic to validate the actual model. Then, using literature surveys, we've tried to make classifications for both the larvae and the adults. So we've taken these key parameters, the temperature, salinity, oxygen, and currents for both larvae and the adults, and we've come up with 3 categories. So one is where it won't be conducive for the production or survival of both the larvae or the adults. 2, where survival is possible, and 3, where it's the optimal conditions, if you like, for the growth of the shipworm. So once we had our model, and then we had these classifications, we could use GIS. We used the ArcGIS model builder to actually data mine within the GS to create scenarios representing the possibility of attack. And basically, to sum up, we looked at hindcast data. As I say, the project ran from 2009 to 2011. So we managed to collect data from 1980, and we could then do a forecast up until 2020, which has already passed us. But we can see, if we look at the red line here, we could see that shipworm were likely to spread as far as the eastern coasts of Germany going into Poland. And thankfully, in the northern parts of the Baltic, we shouldn't see the occurrence of the shipworm. But they, according to the model, they were gradually moving eastwards because of increases, certainly in the temperature. The outputs of the project, which you can download as PDFs from the homepage, are the guidelines for predicting decay by shipworm in the Baltic Sea, which basically goes through the whole process. In 20 minutes, I can't go through really into depth on how we did all this, but it shows you the process for the actual Mike 3 model, also the literature searches for how we looked at the parameters which affect the shipworm, but then also how we did the data mining. So it would be very interesting to actually go back and have a look at this now, as we're finding that a lot of data which is collected certainly as part of EU projects and European related projects, and I believe NOAA has similar kinds of data, is actually being published online, and I can put a link or send it to McKenna later. BioOracle and EMODNet are collating lots of this kind of data. We also had a second guideline where we could try to say, okay, if we do find a site that is threatened and we believe it is of high value and high risk, that how we could try to preserve these sites in situ. But as I've said, the modelling only went up to 2020, and fortunately or unfortunately, we could already see last year in 2019, there was again a lot of concern about shipworm are eating their way through underwater cultural heritage and harbours, that we are seeing them actually getting into these areas in the northeast of Germany and into Poland now. So the model is showing, but it does just show that that we haven't solved the problem. We're being able to identify where these shipworm are occurring, but then what do we do after this? Christine was, as Christina was saying, I think it's the importance of actually collaborating with other ocean scientists, and there's been a lot of work, certainly in terms of the pteridids, the shipworm in European coastal waters, certainly from the economic impacts. And their work, which was back in 2014, is also showing the importance of temperature and salinity. We can see that the temperature is gradually increasing, and it determines the distribution of these pteridids. We can see over time, from when people have been studying them back in the 40s and 50s, that they are gradually moving northwards as temperatures are increasing, certainly around the British coasts and around the North Sea and into the Baltic. But it seems, because the different organisms have different lifestyle strategies, for example, Trido nivalis, the small larvae that float around in the water, they can survive up to 2 or 3 weeks before they actually land on the wood and start growing and metamorphose into the adult shipworm and start burrowing into the wood. Lyrodus, which is causing a lot of concern at the moment, it has a different reproduction strategy where it can straight away settle on wood when it finds it. And the Nototorido norvagica, it actually has it doesn't like competition with the Trido nivalis or the Lyrodus, so it actually starts producing its larvae later in the year at a different time from the other 2 organisms. And to a bit of a plug really at the end of the talk is to say that most people are hopefully aware of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which is starting this year and running into 2030, which is trying to incorporate or include a whole range of ocean scientists into providing the ocean we want. And there is an Ocean Decade Heritage Network which has been started up. It would be wonderful if people could sign up to support this if you haven't already done this. There's been a publication already on the project, and it would be really good so we can start integrating with the other ocean scientists that are working on these issues. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention. There's my email if anybody would like to contact me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your amazing talk. Your presentation is really important to protecting cultural heritage, and I'm so glad that you were able to share the results of your project with us today. We do have a question, and it's, in Science in 2016, there was an article about a timber recovered from I'm not sure how to pronounce that. With living T. nivalis, do you feel this is a sign of things to come, intolerance for much colder temperatures, as well as the risk of losing the fabulous Baltic wrecks? I am thinking of the Erebus and Terror.
Was it Chris? Thank you, Susan, for the question. Yes, we've been working with colleagues in Svalbard, it's off of Norway, and I personally don't think it is a one-off situation. I think it's going to be a recurring thing. And to put it very bluntly, diving on sites, it's very difficult to validate a lot of these models, which I think is a great way forward, but how we can actually verify and validate these models and what we're seeing on sites. But I've noticed that where we're getting warmer summers and increasing temperatures, it seems to give all of the different kinds of shipworm and the gribble longer time to actually be reproducing. So they're reproducing for a longer period in the year as well. And I think, as I say, as these temperatures are increasing, we are going to be seeing these organisms spreading into colder areas. And it's interesting you mentioned Erebus and Terror. I've been in contact with Parks Canada and John Moore to see if we can actually do some studies, and it would be wonderful to collaborate on those sites to see if we can see the shipworm on the site. I hope that answers the question, Susan.
Are there any other questions? We have lots of time. So if there's not any more questions, again, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your attention.
Our next presenter is actually our last presenter of the session, and it's Dr. Geneva Wright, who is the Senior Lead Underwater Archaeologist for the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, Partnerships and Innovations. Dr. Wright will present on an ontology of the USS Arizona's preservation in a changing climate in the Hawaii region. With that, I would like to turn it to Dr. Geneva Wright.
Thank you, McKenna. Heads up to everyone that I am getting an unstable internet notification. So if you stop being able to hear or see the slides, just give me a heads up and I can switch to a call in. Also, while I'm fighting with my screen to do a share, because apparently it's the first time I've used Zoom this year. A quick notification that I am not, in fact, a doctor yet, because that is the point of my talk. And actually, McKenna, I'm having a hard time sharing screen. So it turns out that it was prescient of you to request our slides. Are you able to share?
Yes, absolutely. Let me pull that up real quick.
Thank you.
Just give me one more second. I'm just trying to pull up your PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Okay, so you should be seeing it now.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, first off, repeating everybody ahead of me, I just want to thank McKenna for putting together this really fantastic forum. I just think it's so critically important for us all to be sharing our work, our questions, our challenges in this really critically important avenue. So McKenna, if you can slide down to the first picture showing a massive explosion, please. Thank you. So this talk focuses on the USS Arizona. It's a steel-hulled battleship sunk in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on 7 December 1941. And this is obviously an iconic American shipwreck. It's a war grave and memorial, and it's also among the many shipwreck sites that contain large amounts of potential marine pollutants. Unlike most similar sites, however, Arizona has been the subject of long-term multidisciplinary studies aimed at understanding the nature of structural changes to the hull. And such data have not yet been modeled against the rapidly shifting environmental variables that we associate with anthropogenic climate change. So my intent with this discussion today is to explore some of the avenues of research that have been pursued over the last few decades, just to start to identify areas where this data might be integrated with climate change related information in order to improve our understanding of the wreck's preservation. And I'm specifically focused on the USS Arizona, but my larger intent is to help us improve our understanding of the complexity and the sobering interaction of these rapidly changing marine environments, basic corrosion parameters, and shipwrecks that contain pollutants. So my disclaimer, and the reason I want to call out that I'm not yet a PhD, is that I'm actually beginning a doctoral program this fall to pursue this research. So you guys are catching me right at the very beginning of this research. So lots of interesting work ahead. But here, right at the onset, I do want to offer a huge amount of gratitude to the National Park Service for sharing their wealth of data to enable this research, and also their generous ongoing collaboration. And I'd also like to thank the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for supporting my work on this project. Next slide, please. USS Arizona was the second and final of the Pennsylvania class of super battleships that were built for the United States Navy at the beginning of the 20th century. And for over 2 decades, this was a floating fortress. It patrolled the waters of the world. It projected American power to friends and foes alike. And by December 1941, after an extensive modernization, Arizona assumed the role of flagship for the US PAC fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Next slide, please. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers sprang an incredibly effective surprise attack on the naval forces of Pearl Harbor, and tied up with the rest of the fleet on Battleship Row, had a full load of fuel and ammunition. Arizona was a sitting duck. After weathering several minor hits and near misses, it was struck by a 16-inch armor-piercing shell. It glanced off the number 2 turret and pierced the forward powder magazine. And at 8:06 a.m., a colossal secondary explosion obliterated the forward half of the battleship, along with 1,177 members of the ship's crew. Next slide, please. Today, the remains of the battleship and the USS Arizona Memorial are managed by the National Park Service as the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument. In addition to welcoming more than 1.2 million visitors annually to the summer site, Park Service managers have also worked over the last few decades to improve their understanding of the structural integrity of the shipwreck. Along with the entombed remains of nearly 1,000 sailors and Marines, this scene of terrible tragedy and sacrifice also still contains an estimated 500,000 gallons of fuel oil inside the deteriorating hull. Currently, the shipwreck releases oil at a rate of between 2 and 4 quarts a day. As the battleship gradually rusts and collapses, the oil's release is inevitable. Next slide, please. So one obvious question is, why don't the Park Service pump the oil out? And the short answer is that they can't remove the oil from the ship without destroying it as a structure. Arizona was built to withstand battle damage. Its fuel is spread over hundreds of individual tanks, and to reach each one would entail removal of large portions of the ship and intrusion into a war grave. So to balance preservation with mitigation of a potential environmental threat, They have to be both respectful and responsible while determining the best course of action. So to find that best course, in 1998, the Park Service began the USS Arizona Preservation Project, a long-term multidisciplinary research program aimed at understanding the nature and rate of the deterioration of the battleship. The idea was to build basic research towards making informed decisions for the ship's long-term preservation and to minimize environmental hazards from a potential fuel oil release. Next slide, please. So a good place to start, somewhat like this paper, was with understanding what was there. So to begin with, researchers Tim Fekke and Lee Ma from the National Institute of Science and Technology developed a finite element model. This is a digital model that can theorize structural alterations under a stress load using experimental or observed variables on identified components or finite elements of a complex structure, like a World War II battleship. This allows input of multiple variables, including corrosion rates, to enable component-specific as well as holistic assessments of structural integrity. NAST put together the finite element model between frames 70 and 90, which is the main area where oil releases were observed. The structure was modeled as built from the original builder's plans, which included sufficient structural detail so as to accurately simulate mechanical responses. And the intent here was to physically model structural deterioration from corrosion modeling at the wreck. Next slide, please. Study conducted next was by Pamela Morris of the Hollings Marine Laboratory at the Medical University of South Carolina to conduct an environmental assessment of the oil leaking from the USS Arizona. And the objectives of the study included testing and analysis to determine the chemical characterization of the oil, an assessment of the oil composition in the sediments around the ship, and then finally to look at how environmentally enriched microorganisms could help degrade the leaked oil. And the findings of that study indicated positive markers that the oil could be substantially degraded by the local sediment microorganisms. But now this raises more questions as to how such microbial communities might be affected by climate shifts that specifically impact the current aerobic marine environment. Next slide, please. So continuing with our look into microbial communities, researchers from the Division of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University investigated the role of microorganisms on the corrosion of the wreck, with goals to isolate and identify microorganisms specific to the Pearl Harbor environment, and then determine which were responsible specifically for steel corrosion. And the recommendations from their work included investigation into environmental parameters that influence microbial corrosion, specifically including temperature. You might be picking up on a theme here. Next slide, please. Another study led by the US Geological Survey centered on an analysis of the geological substrate surrounding and beneath the USS Arizona to determine its nature and characteristics. And the basic question they were after was, how stable are the supporting sediments underneath the battleship? And is it possible that Arizona is destabilized due to shifting sediments? So these researchers used a combination of remote sensing and geotechnical analysis of several 15-meter cores taken from around the wreck site. Stratigraphic descriptions and geotechnical analysis of the cores provided data about sediment consolidation, the compression properties, and the triaxial shear strength of the distinct strata beneath the seabed. So then they combined this information with wide area chirp data to extend the identified properties to the subsurface geological strata of Pearl Harbor surrounding the battleship. Next slide, please. Sorry, McKenna, I can't tell if you're advancing the slide deck. Can everybody see environmental modeling? Someone come off mute and give me a shout.
Not yet, hang in there.
Thank you. I'll just continue speaking ad hoc while we work to get the slide deck preservation. So one of the next elements that the researchers employed, which was really helpful for someone who's specifically interested in environmental impacts, was a long-term high-resolution physical and chemical oceanographic measurements taken at the memorial from 2002 to 2005 to better understand the nature of the environment surrounding the submerged ship, and then to determine the long-term and seasonable variability in the key parameters that affect corrosion. So specifically what they were after was to understand how waves, currents, and water column properties, including temperature, salinity, pH, turbidity, O2 reduction potential, and dissolved oxygen in the vicinity of the memorial vary spatially and temporally. So this is an incredible baseline set of data over the last couple decades. Next slide, please. So finally, one of the most important steps towards identifying corrosion rates and predicting the structural strength of Arizona was to measure the thicknesses of the surviving hull components. Essentially, how much hull is left from the original structure? How quickly has it degraded? And so to answer this question, the Park Service pursued several lines of inquiry. For direct measurements, 10-centimeter hull samples were taken at 8 locations along the hull, which were then immediately sealed after removal. And these samples served as controlled sites, but because of the intrusive nature of the sampling, it wasn't really practical for widespread use throughout the shipwreck. Ultrasonic measurements were another possibility to measure the steel thickness, but it required extensive preparation of the measurement site, including removal of concretions and buffing to create a perfectly even surface. So after much research, a new minimum impact method of choice was developed called the concretion equivalent corrosion rate. Next slide, please. I'll preface this by saying that I think Christina had mentioned that she's not a chemist. Neither am I, although I think I'm about to have a much greater crash course in chemistry. And so the idea here is that by taking samples of USS Arizona's hull concretions and analyzing them for specific attributes, an expression for corrosion rate was derived where you multiply a rate constant times the density of the concretion thickness in centimeters, the total iron in weight %, and then you divide the product by time submerged in years. So basically, if you can get a sample of a hull concretion with a known submersion time and determine its density, its thickness, and the weight % of total iron, you can establish a corrosion rate of the hull area or artifact where the sample was taken. Next slide, please. So the idea was that this was a big step forward for corrosion analysis with minimal impact, but it also helped to lead to the development of another concept, which I find much more interesting, which was to apply environmental variables to corrosion studies, offering a continuum for shipwreck deterioration that would incorporate site-specific environmental conditions for increased accuracy. Next slide, please. So the Wines number concept proposes that with known values for temperature, oxygen concentration, and concretion thickness, corrosion rates can be calculated on a linear plot as a function of reciprocal absolute temperature. So they're defined by a dimensionless ratio where the actual corrosion rate, as expressed by the CER equation above, or through direct hole measurements, and where apparent oxygen-driven corrosion rate, which is calculated from the diffusion of oxygen through the concretion at the same sites, expressed by this formula where dissolved O2 and concretion thickness are the variables. So the idea behind this is to correct for environmental variables such as temperature and O2 concentration that have a direct impact on corrosion. So not only does this method allow for determining more accurate corrosion rates, but also allows us to theorize the implications of changing marine environments at specific wreck sites. For example, as the ocean warms, as dissolved O2 levels increase, we could better predict those effects on shipwreck corrosion. And it's been argued that it's impossible to accurately forecast climate change impacts at specific sites, but my hope is that the use of these concepts might enable that. Next slide, please. So if what you're all taking away from this is that the USS Arizona is arguably one of the most researched and analyzed shipwreck sites in the world, you are correct. So standing on the shoulders of the scientists and the researchers who have been conducting groundbreaking multidisciplinary efforts to understand this site is really humbling and frankly pretty intimidating. The more so when I'm only at the earliest stages of trying to identify where we can integrate regional and site-specific environmental variables and see where climate change impact forecasting is feasible. Next slide, please. So this incorporation of environmental variables with the extant data is necessary, as you all know, in a world experiencing unprecedentedly rapid climate change. So corrosion models that are built solely on direct sampling necessarily assume a static marine environment, building a time to fail continuum based on the whole structure lost over a known time frame. But as we all know, we're all familiar with this slide, the marine environment is not static. One of the major changes is dramatic surface warming, and it's worth pointing out, without taking into account biological effects, that corrosion rates of metals approximately double for every 10 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Ocean warming also holds implications for other preservation impacts, including the elimination of global ice coverage and correspondingly increased oxidation. Next slide, please. As you've also heard, ocean acidification is a major element. Corrosion rates for iron are relatively independent of pH ranges between 4 and 9, but corrosion will be affected by changes in ocean temperature, water movement, and shifting climate variables. Moreover, as you heard Christina talk about, increased acidity in the oceans can impact calcium carbonate-based concretions in this place. She was talking about biological organisms. We have already seen that the rapid dissolution of corals and benthic calcifiers in the pH levels projected for the end of the century. And we can determine that archaeological concretions are also going to be affected, as well as shipwreck corrosion rates. So in short, climate change has a direct impact on the deterioration of archaeological materials, including potentially polluting shipwrecks. Therefore, utilizing corrosion formulas that incorporate environmental variables are not only encouraging a minimally invasive procedure for understanding deterioration, they're also promoting a much more accurate and holistic approach to understanding structural sustainability in a time when the marine environment is dramatically changing. Next slide, please. So the USS Arizona is the focus of my research, but it is far from the only potentially polluting shipwreck that's out there. During World War II specifically, Germany and Japan attacked merchant shipping off the United States coast with remarkable efficiency and success. And this was a war fought for many reasons, but it proved to be the first global conflict where acquiring oil and limiting your enemy's access to it and other resources was a predominant strategy. U-boats specifically targeted Allied tankers, and the destruction of merchant ships carrying oil and other hazardous contaminant cargo resulted in numerous potentially polluting shipwrecks in US waters and indeed around the world. Next slide, please. Many of you are familiar with the 2012 NOAA roulette study of potentially polluting wrecks in US waters. And they examined over 30,000 targets, and they designated 87 shipwrecks as high priority sites, shipwrecks that pose threat of substantial oil pollution. And there's a variety of response strategies available for managing these sites, but the use of corrosion analysis tools that incorporate environmental variables, such as the Wines number concept, might offer a clear estimation of time to failure and aid in oil spill preparation. Next slide, please. I can't see it moving on my end, but I'm just going to keep going. We know that the use of CECR and Wines number modeling is relatively low cost and minimally invasive. It hasn't yet been heavily implemented in underwater archaeology, but with the rising threats associated with climate change, my hope is that its relevancy is going to be brought to the forefront. So understanding the deterioration of potentially polluting shipwrecks is a big job, but in addition to the USS Arizona, there's many sites for application. So one example is the Coast Guard's research on known potentially polluting wrecks of District 7 in South Florida. So based on the 2012 Roulette's database, shipwrecks were assessed as hazards based on their likelihood of catastrophic failure and on the potential damage of the cargo. So these values were graded as high, medium, and low, and the combined score gives them a color value for this map that corresponds to their potential threat to the regional ecosystem. In this scheme, Gulf State, which is there in that red star, is the most potentially polluting wreck, scoring as high risk for both most probable and worst case oil discharges. But in the same area, the Coast Guard has been working to align potentially polluting shipwreck sites with environmentally integrated corrosion rates, assessed by the Wines number modeling. So by using environmental data and overlaying the highest temperature, salinity, and dissolved O2 regions, the Coast Guard determined that the shipwreck Pan Massachusetts, up here in the blue circle, is a much higher threat and indeed has probably lost a great deal more hull material than Gulf State. Next slide, please. So the Coast Guard is seeking prioritization of potentially polluting wrecks with high-risk corrosion rates. The data also offers a baseline for archaeological sustainability. So using this groundwork, my hope is that I can begin taking some of the pathways that they've structured and begin to apply them to the data for USS Arizona, beginning the predictive testing of the changing marine environments. Next slide, please. So to tie all of these thoughts together, hopefully you can have a chuckle that I have a philosophy by Post-it. So this sticky note has been taped to my monitor for the last 5 years and has this very eloquent reminder from Jonathan Adams that a discipline of inquiry is defined by its ontology, what there is to know, its epistemology, how do we know what we know, as well as its methodologies. The aims are serviced by theories and methods, and without the former, the latter are mere process. So as I've begun to review and absorb the breadth and tonnage of scholarship that exists around the USS Arizona, I have come to appreciate that answering the question of Arizona's ontology is a really big job. But the bigger job is still ahead. The real question of what there is to know is not only one of synthesis for a huge amount of multidisciplinary research. It also demands the identification of critical factors that are required to establish stability assessments for other potentially polluting shipwrecks that will never receive the same amount of testing and study as the Arizona, but will still face accelerated deterioration in a time of anthropogenic climate change. Next slide, please. So to conclude, USS Arizona holds a powerful place in our collective memory. It is a scene of battle, of tragedy, and it may also represent an important role on the modern battlefield of climate change. Research from this ship has offered underwater archaeologists significant direction in analyzing corrosion data while emphasizing minimally invasive procedures. Gaining a detailed understanding of the interaction between the marine environment and corrosion is essential for site management, particularly in the face of the potentially dramatic environmental shifts that are simulated by climate change. It's my hope that this research will offer directions for other metal-hulled shipwrecks, particularly in understanding climate change impacts for sites around the world. And last slide, please. So finally, I just want to acknowledge the tremendous efforts and research that have been conducted on this site to date, particularly acknowledging the work of Larry Murphy, Matt Russell, and Dave Conlon for incorporating multidisciplinary perspectives and enabling my future research. So with that, I am very happy for questions, and I want to thank all of you and McKenna especially for rolling on the fly with technical difficulties. So thank you guys.
Well, what an amazing presentation to end this session of the conference. And I want to apologize for losing internet connection. I'm not sure what happened there, but regardless, I really enjoyed your presentation. If people have questions, they can put them in the chat. I think we already have one. Is there potential for corrosion to cause remaining UXO on Arizona to become unstable and hazardous?
Susan, I think that's a wonderful question. And the short answer is I don't know, but I would anticipate that the answer is probably yes. And that's absolutely an avenue for research, not just for any UXOs still present on Arizona, but on any of these other military lost sites. Thank you, Steph. Sorry, I'm just responding in real time.
Are there any other questions? David Gregory asked, have the corrosion studies only been carried out on hull plating or on structural elements as well?
Thanks, David. I think that the direct measurement studies were only on the hull plating. The CECR, I think, was conducted on the structural elements as well, at least doing the concretion analysis. So, and then a lot of the interior modeling that could incorporate the corrosion model analysis was done on the structural elements inside as well as on the exterior sections of the hull.
The next question is, to what extent can all the work on Arizona be applied to World War II wrecks in Pacific, like Solomons Island, etc.?
Thanks, Ola. I think that that's exactly the intent of my research, is to answer that question, because, you know, ostensibly you would think that if you can derive the specific key variable points that you can collect on other metal hulled shipwrecks, you could apply the same theories, and that's kind of what I'm trying to drill down to. You know, that said, I think that there's an acknowledgement there that just the point that we're using Arizona to help create all of these structures because there's such a wealth of knowledge and background information. And so we might find areas where, with lacking 2 decades of previous research, we'll be more limited in what we can apply to other sites. But that's certainly the intent, is to have a model that can be used elsewhere.
The next question is, do you have in mind the shipwreck project SOS in the Mediterranean?
Thank you. There's actually there's several different shipwreck projects that I'm really wanting to engage with for this research. So thank you. There's been some incredible work done out of Southampton, SOS certainly. I mean, it's really comforting to know that there is a lot of people who are asking similar questions to help drive this research. So absolutely, thank you.
I would like to also open it up to like 5 to 10 minutes of questions that can be addressed to all of the presenters. Attendees, you can put your questions in the chat box, or you can ask them by unmuting yourself. Additionally, I would like to invite additional discussion of the ocean decade. Anyone who wishes, maybe we have audience members who are also involved in the ocean decade program. So just kind of open it up for discussion for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will conclude this conference session with some closing remarks. Additionally, if any of the presenters want to add anything about the research that they weren't able to share in their presentation, please feel free to do that as well. We have a question for Dr. Gregory. It asks, do you foresee receiving or seeking additional funds to build on your previous study?
In terms of the shipworm, we are doing some other studies, but far more on a national level. But we're looking at all other kinds of things to do with climate change, but this question of in situ preservation. So we've been successful with the European funding. We've got other applications in as well. But as Geneva and Christina and many other people are saying, there's so many fantastic areas of research that we need to look into to understand these basic, still these fundamental processes, I think. And it seems that we're trying to still understand the natural processes, but then we've got anthropogenic climate change, which is natural processes plus, or on steroids, if you like. So I think there's a lot more work to do, and it would be lovely to continue collaborating with as many other, both marine archaeologists, heritage managers, but also scientists as well. So yeah, so we are looking at shipworm as one of the projects we're looking at, but also looking at seagrass. We're looking at the deterioration of wrecks in the North Sea, very much along the lines of what Geneva's been talking about as well. So yeah, too many things, too little time. But I think one other thing I've noticed, and I think Tom was on about it earlier as well in his presentation, that it seems as a community we have been aware of climate change for quite a long while, and it seems to go in fits and spurts in terms of the funding. And when we got the funding for the RepProtect, which was, we started on the application back in 2007, it was again a period of when there was a lot of interest in terms of climate change and cultural heritage. And it seems, certainly within Europe, looking at the latest Horizon Europe thematic framework, which is starting this year, there is again an awful lot of interest in climate change and in terms of cultural heritage, not just tangible heritage, but also how it's affecting, it can affect intangible heritage as well. So there's, if it's okay, McKenna, I could send you some links to other projects that may be of interest to other participants, certainly of European projects that I'm aware of.
Yes, absolutely. Send all the links you can.
Yeah. A bit of a ramble, sorry.
Well, are there any other questions, or does people want to talk about anything related to Ocean Decade or climate change and archaeology, even people in the audience?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Good to see a number of you, at least online. A couple things that I think we should probably discuss a bit and talk about is that as this Ocean Decade is moving forward, while we are also grappling and need to continue to grapple with the effects of climate change, there's a few things that are also, I think, particularly relevant. This Ocean Decade offers us an opportunity to really push and continue to integrate submerged cultural resources and maritime archaeological resources on beaches into the larger discussion of ocean exploration, ocean research. And I think some of these papers that I've heard today really powerfully have hit on, those multidisciplinary aspects. The United States recently held a series of meetings to identify priorities for the next 10 years for ocean survey. And that included a fair amount of discussion by a number of folks, some of whom are on this call, in and around the submerged cultural resource question, but also, and importantly, the need to not only integrate with other scientists, but also to very importantly take note of and involve, not just consult, but involve Indigenous participation and Indigenous perspectives. That, I think, is going to go a long way. We're also doing the same thing to address things internationally. There's currently a series of efforts underway to begin to look at larger ocean areas, and recently Conservation International started working to move forward with a new and very expanded marine area out in the South Pacific, just off the coasts of Chile and Peru, stretching along the submerged ridgeline of the Salas y Gomez and the Nazca submerged, mountain chain, a very big area. And as part of that, they asked for and have included an overall context study that looks at the maritime heritage of the area. I see this all as promising. I also see that as we continue to do this work, more players coming into the field, particularly with deep sea exploration technology, as well as opportunities that are available, are also going to help a very, very great deal. So thanks for just being able to say a few things. This is a really good session, and it's good to see everybody, and it's good to see these presentations.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that information and being so kind. Thank you. I would like to now conclude with some closing remarks. Just thank you to all of the speakers who took the time to present today. All of the presentations today were very, very meaningful and greatly contributed to the discussion of climate change and archaeology. Thank you again to all of the audience members for coming today and asking questions during the question and answer session. And most importantly, recognizing the importance of understanding the negative effects climate change poses to underwater cultural resources. Please join us tomorrow for our second session with Champ in Australia. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. And until then, have a great rest of your day, or if you're on the other side of the world, have a great rest of your night. Thank you.